My son texted me on a Friday night, "Do not come to my wedding. My wife does not want you there." I closed his bank accounts without saying a single word. The next day, they were at my doorstep. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Byron Ellis. I am 69 years old. I spent my entire life building a massive legacy from absolute dirt. I sat in my quiet kitchen in Chicago. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. My phone lit up on the cold granite counter. A text message from Jalen, my 32-year-old son, flashed on the screen. I put on my reading glasses and opened the message. The words delivered a direct physical blow to my chest. Jalen told me not to come to his wedding tomorrow. He explained that Vanessa, his fiancée, did not want a black, blue-collar carpenter sitting in the front row. She worried I would embarrass her in front of her wealthy white family. She thought my presence would ruin the pristine aesthetic of her high society event. She felt disgusted by my worn hands and my simple suits. Jalen asked me to understand his position. He wrote that this was the most important day of his life. He claimed he could not risk upsetting Vanessa or her elitist parents. He instructed me to stay home and pretend I had a sudden illness. He actually typed those words and sent them to the man who raised him alone after his mother died. I read the message twice. I felt the sharp sting of betrayal cut deep into my soul. My own flesh and blood chose a fragile facade of prestige over his own father. He discarded me to appease a family of arrogant snobs. They judged a man by the designer label on his jacket rather than the actual content of his character. I set the phone down on the counter. I did not type a reply. I did not call him to yell or demand an explanation. A man who demands respect from a coward only degrades himself. I simply stared at the screen, letting the reality of his betrayal wash over me. The boy I had protected from every hardship had grown into a man who despised his own shadow. I did not shed a single tear. I looked down at my hands in the dim kitchen light. They were rough, heavily scarred, and thick with calluses from decades of relentless physical labor. Those hands had framed houses, poured concrete, and laid the unshakable foundation for Ellis Holdings. I started as a poor carpenter with a single hammer. I quietly built a real estate and construction empire worth millions of dollars. I never flaunted my wealth to the world. I drove an old pickup truck and lived in a modest suburban home. I hid the true extent of my massive empire from Jalen on purpose. I wanted my son to learn the value of a hard day of work. I wanted him to understand that real money is earned through heavy sweat and sacrifice. It is never handed out on a silver platter. I wanted him to face the world with grit and resilience. My late wife Nadine and I agreed on this core principle long ago. We spent nights at the kitchen table counting pennies to ensure his future was secure. We wanted to raise a strong, independent man who respected his roots. Instead, Jalen became incredibly weak. He became a coward who bowed his head to a woman who despised the very soil he came from. He used the generous monthly allowance I provided to masquerade as a highly successful entrepreneur in Vanessa's exclusive social circle. He deliberately forgot who paid for his luxury apartment and his custom designer clothes. He forgot the blood and sweat that funded his incredibly comfortable life. My silence in that kitchen was not surrender. It was the calm before a devastating storm. I walked down the hallway into my home office and sat at my heavy oak desk. I opened my laptop and entered my secure credentials. The bright screen illuminated my face in the dark room. I navigated directly to the master trust account portal for Ellis Holdings. I had built this digital fortress to protect our assets, and now I was using it to tear down his illusions. I stared at the glowing green numbers representing my life's work. It was time to teach my arrogant son the ultimate lesson in reality. I clicked on the Administrative User Management tab. I scrolled down and found Jalen's name attached to 3 platinum corporate credit cards. These were the exact cards he used to buy expensive dinners, tailored suits, and lavish gifts for Vanessa's pretentious family. I selected all 3 active accounts and hit the cancellation button. The banking system prompted me to confirm the permanent termination of the cards. I clicked confirm without a single second of hesitation. The screen refreshed immediately and the active status turned to closed. Next, I moved to the scheduled electronic transfers section. For the past 3 years, I had authorized a $6,000 monthly auto transfer. This money covered the expensive rent for his luxury downtown penthouse. I highlighted the recurring payment profile and deleted it completely. I watched the final confirmation message pop up on the screen. The deletion was irreversible without my physical signature at the bank. Finally, I accessed the corporate subsidiary company account. This was the small logistics firm I allowed Jalen to manage so he could build his executive resume. He used it as his personal piggy bank to impress his demanding fiancée. I executed a total executive override. I changed the administrative passwords and revoked all his digital privileges. I froze the entire subsidiary account and locked him out of every financial avenue connected to my name. The financial cord was cut instantly and permanently. All the vast resources he took for granted vanished into thin air. He had traded his loyal father for a seat at a table where he did not belong. Now he would have to pay for his own expensive meal. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my heavy leather chair. The digital execution took less than 5 minutes. It was a silent, bloodless strike that would completely dismantle his fake reality by tomorrow morning. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of hot black coffee. I took a slow sip and enjoyed the sharp, bitter taste. The master dashboard on my phone confirmed a zero balance across all of Jalen's access points. Across town at an exclusive 5-star restaurant, the wedding rehearsal dinner was in full swing. Vanessa and her parents were busy showing off their perceived wealth to their elite guests. They drank imported champagne and ate caviar. Jalen sat at the head table playing the role of the highly successful, wealthy groom. The head waiter approached him discreetly with a black leather billfold. The total tab for the extravagant rehearsal dinner was exactly $15,000. The restaurant demanded payment before serving the final dessert course. Jalen confidently pulled out his wallet and handed over his primary platinum corporate card. A few tense minutes later, the waiter returned. He leaned down and whispered that the card had been declined. Jalen frowned, muttered an excuse about a bank error, and handed over a second platinum card. The waiter walked away and came back with the exact same apologetic expression. The second card was also declined. Panic began to set in deep inside Jalen's chest. He pulled out his third and final card, his hands trembling slightly under the white tablecloth. The restaurant manager stepped over to the table this time. He held the declined card up and informed Jalen that the bank had flagged the account as permanently closed. The manager requested an alternative form of payment immediately, or he would involve the authorities to resolve the unpaid debt. Vanessa noticed the sudden commotion and glared at Jalen. Her wealthy parents stopped talking and stared at my son with blatant, undeniable judgment. The fragile facade of the self-made millionaire cracked wide open under the bright ballroom lights. The luxurious world Jalen had bought with my hard-earned money evaporated right in front of his new family. He had no cash, no backup accounts, and no way to cover the massive bill. The absolute nightmare had officially begun. I did not need to be standing inside that opulent 5-star restaurant to witness the exact moment my son's entire fabricated universe collapsed. The real-time security alerts flashing across my laptop screen told the complete and humiliating story. The initial swipe of his primary platinum credit card registered on my secure dashboard at exactly 8:40 in the evening. The banking system rejected the massive transaction instantly. I could perfectly picture Jalen standing at the maitre d's register. The heavy crystal chandeliers of the ballroom cast a harsh, unforgiving light on his sudden panic. He surely offered a charming, dismissive smile to the head waiter playing the role of a man mildly inconvenienced by a banking glitch. He pulled out his second platinum card, the specific account he reserved for international vacations and luxury car leases. He handed it over with forced confidence. The waiter ran the magnetic stripe through the terminal. The machine beeped a sharp, undeniable warning. The screen flashed the same absolute rejection, declined. Jalen's perfectly tailored designer tuxedo suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket. He fumbled frantically for his third card. This was the corporate emergency line, the card strictly meant for Ellis Holdings' logistical operations and heavy equipment purchases. He handed it to the waiter with trembling fingers. The terminal flashed red a third time. Access denied. Across the sprawling private dining room, Vanessa's wealthy white parents sat at the head table. They possessed the kind of generational arrogance that demanded absolute perfection from everyone around them. They noticed the delay at the front register. They noticed the heavy sweat forming on the brow of the black man who had promised their precious daughter a life of endless luxury. The polished facade of Jalen, the self-made tycoon, splintered right there on the imported marble floor. He stood entirely exposed before a crowd of elite guests who secretly believed he never belonged in their exclusive world to begin with. The polite discretion of the waitstaff evaporated immediately. The general manager stepped into the fray to handle the escalating situation. He carried the heavy leather billfold containing a staggering balance of $15,000 for the rehearsal dinner alone. He demanded immediate payment in full. He informed Jalen that their hospitality had reached its absolute limit. If a valid payment method was not produced within 5 minutes, he would lock the restaurant doors and call the police to report grand theft of services. Vanessa noticed the tense confrontation from across the room. She abandoned her glass of imported champagne and stormed over in her designer silk dress. She did not ask what was wrong. She demanded that Jalen fix the minor inconvenience immediately. She ordered him to stop embarrassing her in front of her prestigious family and their influential friends. Jalen could barely breathe. His hands shook violently as he pulled out his smartphone. He opened the mobile banking application, desperately trying to transfer funds directly from the corporate subsidiary accounts. The screen refreshed and displayed a glaring red error message. His administrative privileges were completely revoked. The realization struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The bottomless well of my money had vanished overnight. He looked at Vanessa with wide, terrified eyes. He had absolutely nothing. The carefully constructed lie he fed his future wife shattered into jagged pieces right before her eyes. The manager crossed his arms and signaled the security guards standing by the main entrance. The very real threat of police intervention and criminal charges hung heavy in the suffocated air of the restaurant. Jalen opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was a fraud, and the entire room was watching his unmasking. My phone vibrated violently against the heavy oak wood of my desk. The bright screen illuminated the dark corners of my home office. The caller ID displayed Jalen's name. He was calling me frantically. He was dialing the very man he had explicitly banned from his wedding just 4 hours prior. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair. I watched the phone vibrate, inching slowly across the polished wood. I did not reach for it. I felt the phantom weight of a steel hammer in my right hand. I remembered working double shifts on construction sites during the brutal winter storms. I remembered my frozen fingers bleeding just so Jalen could attend a private academy and never know the crushing sting of poverty. My late wife Nadine and I had sacrificed our youth to build an impenetrable fortress for him. We wanted him to stand tall and proud as an independent man. Jalen took that fortress and handed the keys to a woman who viewed my black skin and blue-collar roots as a shameful stain on her high society aesthetic. He erased my existence to buy her conditional affection. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started buzzing again. Pure panic drove his relentless calls. I slowly reached out and picked up the device. I did not answer his desperate plea for salvation. I turned the phone face down against the leather blotter. The buzzing became a muffled, insignificant noise. I refused to throw a lifeline to a traitor. I refused to finance my own disrespect. I leaned back and took a slow sip of my bitter black coffee. The financial execution was absolute, and I felt no remorse. He made his choice to cast me out. I simply honored his request. Back at the restaurant, the manager delivered his final, merciless verdict. The $15,000 debt remained unpaid. The rehearsal dinner was officially terminated. Furthermore, the manager canceled the venue reservation for the actual wedding ceremony scheduled for the following afternoon. He ordered the entire wedding party to vacate the premises immediately. The lavish, picture-perfect dream evaporated instantly. Vanessa completely lost her mind. She shrieked in genuine horror, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the opulent lobby. Her parents rushed forward, their faces pale with profound mortification. The high society guests gasped, whispering viciously behind their hands while pulling out their phones to record the spectacular downfall. The absolute humiliation broke Vanessa. She hurled her designer clutch at Jalen's chest, cursing his name in front of her entire family. Jalen was paralyzed by the public disgrace. The profound humiliation quickly twisted into raw, blinding fury. He grabbed Vanessa by the arm, dragging her away from the flashing cameras and the mocking whispers of her peers. They burst through the glass doors and ran out to the valet stand. They jumped into his leased sports car, a vehicle I personally paid for, and sped off into the dark night. The panic consumed them entirely. They knew exactly who held the key to their survival. They drove recklessly across the city, breaking speed limits, heading straight toward my neighborhood. They wanted answers. They wanted their stolen status returned immediately. They wanted the unlimited money they believed was their birthright. The nightmare had fully materialized, and they were bringing the storm directly to my doorstep. The heavy oak front door of my suburban home rattled under the violent force of a pounding fist. The digital clock on the hallway console, glowing a stark crimson, displayed 12:15 in the morning. I stood in the darkened corridor. I watched the thick wood shake on its hinges. The muffled, shrill screams of a woman pierced the quiet night. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Jalen and Vanessa stood on my front porch. The torrential rain soaked their expensive clothes. Vanessa wore a ruined designer silk dress that clung to her shivering frame. Her makeup ran down her flushed cheeks in dark streaks. Jalen stood slightly behind her. He looked like a cornered animal. Vanessa did not wait for an invitation to speak. She launched into a vicious tirade the moment the door swung open. She pointed a manicured finger inches from my face. She called me a bitter, jealous old man. She screamed that I deliberately sabotaged the most important night of her life because I could not handle her family's success. She claimed my actions were a pathetic attempt to punish her for protecting her high society wedding from a miserable blue-collar carpenter. She demanded that I immediately transfer the necessary funds to reopen the venue. She ordered me to fix the catastrophic humiliation I had caused her parents. Jalen kept his eyes glued to the wet porch planks. He refused to look me in the eye. He let his furious bride fight his battles. He hid behind her rage just as he had hidden behind my bank accounts. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I simply stared at the two wet, desperate strangers standing on my property. I reached into the interior pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper. I bypassed Vanessa completely and stepped forward. I forced Jalen to look up from the rain-soaked wood. I extended my arm and pressed the official banking document flat against his chest. Jalen slowly raised his trembling hands and took the paper. His eyes scanned the bold black text printed by the Federal Reserve System. It was the formal declaration of permanent account closure and subsidiary liquidation. The color drained entirely from his face. He read the zero balance and the immediate termination of all corporate credit lines. Vanessa snatched the paper from his hands. She read the figures and her arrogant shouting died in her throat. She looked up at me in absolute horror. The realization struck her that the bottomless wealth she married into was instantly eradicated. Jalen opened his mouth. He stammered, asking what this meant for his bills, his lifestyle, his impending honeymoon. I looked him dead in the eye. My voice cut through the sound of the falling rain like a steel blade. I told him the meaning was perfectly clear. I told him I only finance my family. I only provide a safety net for people who respect the blood in their veins. I informed him that he officially relinquished his status as my son at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon when he sent that text message. He traded his father for the approval of arrogant strangers. I finalized the transaction by removing my capital from his life. He was now an independent man. He would have to pay for his elite existence with his own sweat. I watched the devastating truth shatter his fragile ego. Jalen dropped to his knees on the wet concrete. The rain pounded against his expensive tuxedo. He threw his pride away and begged for salvation. He pleaded with me to reverse the banking orders. He invoked the name of the one person who could always soften my heart. He mentioned his late mother, Nadine. He cried out that Nadine would never want to see her only child suffer like this. He claimed she would be ashamed of my cruelty. Hearing her name in his mouth ignited a cold, focused fury deep inside my chest. I stepped forward and looked down at his pathetic, kneeling form. I told him never to weaponize his mother's memory against me. I reminded him of the brutal reality of our past. Nadine and I scrubbed floors and framed houses until our hands bled to build the Ellis Holdings fortune. I told him Nadine made me swear on her deathbed to protect him from the crushing weight of poverty. She wanted him to have the opportunities we never had. I kept that sacred promise for over a decade. I gave him a subsidiary company to run. I funded his lavish penthouse. I provided the foundation for his entire life. But Nadine also wanted a son with integrity. She wanted a man who honored his roots. I told Jalen I protected him from poverty, but I could not protect him from his own profound arrogance. He chose to worship the hollow prestige of Vanessa's family over the relentless sacrifice of his own parents. His current suffering was not a punishment from me. It was the direct consequence of his own treacherous choices. He had severed the roots of his own tree, and now he was watching the branches die. Vanessa grabbed Jalen by the collar of his ruined tuxedo jacket. She yanked him up from the wet pavement with furious strength. Her initial shock morphed back into venomous rage. She realized her tears and his begging would yield absolutely no cash from me. She decided to strike back with the only weapon she believed she possessed. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest. She screamed that I was dead to them. She declared that I would never be allowed to meet my future grandchildren. She vowed that I would never step foot inside their $2 million downtown penthouse. She claimed that the luxury home was her private sanctuary, and I was permanently banned from their elite world. A slow, chilling smirk spread across my face. I looked at the sheer ignorance burning in her eyes. She genuinely believed Jalen owned the very roof over her head. She had no idea how thoroughly I controlled every single asset in her fake reality. I did not correct her delusion. I did not explain the brutal legal facts. I simply told her to enjoy her night. I stepped backward into my hallway and closed the heavy oak door. I slid the deadbolt firmly into place, locking them out in the cold rain. I turned my back to their muffled shouting. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I scrolled through my contacts and pressed the call button for my lead corporate attorney, Jonathan Pierce. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I gave him one precise, undeniable directive. I told him to prepare the eviction documents for the downtown penthouse immediately. The game was over. The total liquidation of their false empire was scheduled for sunrise. I sat in my home office sipping my morning coffee while the sun rose over the city. I did not need to be physically present at the downtown penthouse to witness the execution of my orders. Jonathan Pierce, my lead corporate attorney, operates with the precision of a military tactician. He called me at exactly 7 in the morning to confirm he had secured the necessary legal backing. I authorized him to proceed without a single shred of mercy. The luxury residential building Jalen occupied was a fortress of glass and steel designed to keep the working class out. It featured a private elevator equipped with biometric scanners, imported Italian marble floors, and a dedicated concierge staff who catered to the arrogant whims of its wealthy tenants. Jonathan bypassed the front desk entirely. He arrived with 2 armed sheriff's deputies. The sight of tactical uniforms and holstered weapons completely shattered the sterile high society aesthetic of the penthouse corridor. The heavy mahogany door of Unit 42 stood at the end of the hall. It was a door I personally paid for, yet I had been explicitly forbidden from ever knocking on it. Jonathan did not hesitate. He raised his fist and pounded on the thick wood with a deafening rhythm. The sound echoed down the pristine hallway, signaling the absolute end of Jalen's unearned reign. Inside the $2 million sanctuary, the chaotic aftermath of their ruined rehearsal dinner still lingered. They had returned home in disgrace the previous night, stripped of their financial power, but still clinging to the illusion of their physical property. Jonathan pounded on the door a second time. The heavy strikes demanded immediate attention. He stood perfectly straight, holding a single manila folder containing the legal documents that would permanently evict my son from his fake reality. The deadbolt clicked, and the heavy door swung open. Vanessa stood in the doorway. The flawless bridal image she had carefully curated for her high society guests was completely obliterated. Her expensive silk robe hung loosely over her shoulders. Her hair was a tangled mess, and dark circles of smeared makeup framed her bloodshot eyes. The severe hangover from a night of hysterical crying and screaming was evident on her flushed face. She glared at Jonathan with profound irritation. She did not immediately register the 2 armed sheriff's deputies standing firmly behind him. Her innate arrogance blinded her to the immediate danger. She firmly believed that her sheer presence commanded absolute obedience from working-class individuals. She crossed her arms and demanded to know who gave them permission to bypass the security desk. She threatened to have the building manager fire the entire lobby staff for letting aggressive strangers up to her private residence. Jonathan did not flinch at her shrill tone. He maintained the cold, detached demeanor of a man who dismantles corporate empires for a living. He simply reached into his manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He extended his arm and pressed the document directly against her chest, forcing her to take it. He informed her in a flat, unwavering voice that this was an official 48-hour eviction notice mandated by the state court. He stated that her presence in the unit was no longer authorized. Vanessa snatched the paper from his hand. She scanned the bold legal print and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She threw her head back and screamed that she was the wife of the property owner. She threatened to call her wealthy father and have Jonathan disbarred for harassment. She genuinely believed her marriage certificate granted her absolute immunity from the law. Vanessa ripped the official eviction notice right down the middle. She threw the torn pieces onto the polished marble floor and ordered Jonathan to get out of her sight. Jonathan did not react to her childish display of temper. He pulled a duplicate copy from his folder and calmly explained the brutal reality she had entirely failed to grasp. He stated that the $2 million penthouse did not belong to Jalen. It never did. The property was a corporate asset fully owned and maintained by Ellis Holdings. He clarified that Byron Ellis, the sole chairman of the board, possessed the exclusive deed to the real estate. Jalen was merely a temporary guest living on a corporate allowance. He owned absolutely nothing. He possessed no equity, no title, and no legal right to remain on the premises. Jonathan's words hit Vanessa like a physical strike to the jaw. The color drained from her face. She turned around just as Jalen emerged from the master bedroom. Jalen wore sweatpants and looked utterly defeated. Vanessa screamed at him, demanding he tell the lawyer to leave their home. Jalen stared at the armed deputies and then looked at the torn eviction notice on the floor. He had spent 3 years pretending he was the master of his own destiny. Now the heavy consequences of his deceit laid bare on the floor. He slowly lowered his head in utter shame. He admitted to his furious wife that the lawyer was telling the absolute truth. He confessed that my company owned the walls, the floors, and every piece of custom furniture inside the apartment. He confirmed they were legally nothing more than trespassers in a property I built from the ground up. Vanessa stumbled backward, grasping the doorframe for support. The devastating realization crushed her superiority. The wealthy, self-made husband she thought she married was entirely a fabrication funded by the blue-collar carpenter she had vehemently rejected. The senior sheriff's deputy stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. He informed Vanessa and Jalen that the 48-hour countdown was a legal courtesy, but their access to the building's luxury amenities was terminated immediately. He ordered them to start packing their personal belongings. The absolute terror of homelessness broke Vanessa's paralyzed silence. She shrieked in genuine panic as she sprinted toward her massive walk-in closet. The deputies stood in the living room watching my son and his arrogant bride frantically stuff expensive designer clothes and shoes into cheap black garbage bags. The humiliation of their hasty exit was absolute. They dragged their trash bags down the private elevator and out into the harsh morning light. Cast out onto the crowded city sidewalk, they sat on the concrete curb surrounded by their ruined possessions. Jalen buried his face in his hands, completely broken by the reality of his own cowardice. Vanessa, however, did not surrender to defeat. Her profound humiliation rapidly morphed into a vindictive, calculating rage. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket. She refused to accept the consequences of her own elitist actions. She decided to strike back using the only weapon she had left. She opened her social media accounts and began recording a live video. She pointed the camera at her tear-stained face and the garbage bags on the street. She deliberately crafted a vicious, fabricated narrative of victimhood. She portrayed me as a mentally unstable, abusive father-in-law who illegally threw a helpless young couple onto the street days before their wedding. She tagged local news outlets and prominent community members to maximize the collateral damage. She declared war on my legacy without understanding the gravity of her mistake. She hit the publish button, initiating a viral smear campaign designed to completely destroy my personal reputation and dismantle the public standing of Ellis Holdings. Vanessa pointed her smartphone camera at her own tear-stained face from the confined, dingy space of a cheap airport motel room. She pressed the record button and unleashed a highly calculated digital assault. She broadcasted a masterful performance of pure, fabricated victimhood to her tens of thousands of online followers. She cried hysterically into the lens, claiming she was the specific target of a vicious, racially motivated vendetta. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of an abusive, mentally unstable old man who despised her simply because she was a white woman marrying into his wealthy family. She told her rapt audience that her father-in-law had finally snapped illegally, locking them out of their own home just 48 hours before they were supposed to exchange their sacred vows. She framed the sudden eviction as an act of severe financial abuse designed to keep her husband trapped under a cruel tyrant's thumb. Jalen sat on the edge of the cheap motel bed in the background of the frame. He kept his head bowed and stared blankly at his hands. He did not utter a single word to correct her vicious lies or defend the father who had given him everything. His cowardice remained absolute. His silence provided the ultimate validation for her fabricated narrative. The video gained massive traction within minutes. The algorithm rewarded her manufactured trauma with thousands of rapid shares. Strangers on the internet flooded the comment sections with absolute unhinged outrage. Local community forums in Chicago eagerly picked up the story, instantly branding Byron Ellis as a vindictive monster. Neighbors who had smiled at me for 20 years suddenly glared at my front iron gates as they drove past. The digital mob formed rapidly, demanding swift justice for the beautiful bride. Vanessa wielded her unearned privilege like a freshly sharpened sword to slaughter my reputation. My private office phone began to ring incessantly by 10 o'clock the following morning. Long-standing business partners, investors, and senior board members of Ellis Holdings flooded my private line with urgent, frantic calls. They had seen the viral video and read the furious, damaging comments circulating online. They expressed deep concern over the sudden public relations nightmare threatening our pristine corporate image. They advised me to hire crisis managers and issue an immediate press release to combat the highly damaging allegations of elder instability and severe financial abuse. I listened to their panicked advice and flatly rejected every single suggestion. A man who defends himself against a howling mob of fools only validates their mindless noise. I refused to engage in a pathetic internet shouting match with a spoiled child. I hung up the phone and chose a completely different, infinitely more dangerous battlefield. I opened my encrypted contact list and dialed the direct number for Hector Silva. Hector was an independent private investigator with a notoriously ruthless reputation in the Chicago corporate underworld. He did not care about social media optics, public opinion, or emotional family drama. He cared exclusively about hard data, hidden paper trails, and unearthing deeply buried secrets. He operated entirely in the shadows, dismantling corporate spies and fraudulent executives with clinical surgical precision. I had utilized his unique skill set twice in the past decade to permanently neutralize hostile corporate takeovers. He answered the phone with his usual gruff efficiency. I did not waste time with polite pleasantries. I told him I required his absolute focus for an emergency domestic operation. I instructed him to drop all his current cases and come to my estate immediately. He arrived at my front gates exactly 40 minutes later, ready for war. I poured Hector a glass of aged bourbon and directed him to the chair opposite my desk. I bypassed the emotional drama of the ruined wedding and the viral internet video entirely. I laid out the precise, unwavering parameters of his assignment. I granted him unrestricted administrative access to the Ellis Holdings digital archives and secure banking portals. I instructed him to launch a ruthless forensic audit of the corporate subsidiary company I had blindly trusted Jalen to manage. I wanted a highly detailed minute-by-minute accounting of every single dollar that flowed in and out of that firm over the past 36 months. I told Hector to trace every vendor payment, every expense report, and every executive bonus Jalen had authorized. My son had successfully funded a multi-million-dollar lifestyle on a standard six-figure executive salary. The basic math simply did not align with reality, and I needed to know exactly why. I did not stop there. I pointed my finger directly at Vanessa's wealthy, arrogant parents. I demanded a complete financial excavation of the Howell family business. Vanessa boasted endlessly about her father's pristine corporate legacy and their unshakable high society status. I wanted to know exactly what fueled their extreme arrogance. I instructed Hector to dig deep into their commercial tax filings, their outstanding corporate credit lines, and their hidden corporate liabilities. I commanded him to leave absolutely no stone unturned in their supposedly perfect lives. I wanted the naked truth, stripped of all its high society glamour and polished pretension. Hector listened intently, his dark eyes tracking every piece of information I provided. He did not ask questions about my sudden ruthlessness toward my own son. He simply nodded, closed his battered notebook, and walked out the door into the city. I spent the next 24 hours maintaining absolute unbreakable radio silence. I ignored the relentless media inquiries, the panicked calls from my executives, and the escalating internet outrage generated by Vanessa's followers. I sat in my quiet house and waited patiently for the real ammunition to arrive. Hector Silva returned to my estate just as the sun began to set the following evening. He bypassed the intercom and walked into my office without knocking. His weathered face was set in a hard, grim line that instantly signaled a massive problem. He approached my heavy oak desk and dropped a thick red folder directly onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the silent, dimly lit room. He did not sit down in the guest chair. He looked at me with a mixture of profound professional respect and a very dark, grim warning. He told me the social media circus outside my gates was the absolute least of my current problems. He strongly advised me to brace myself before opening the file. I reached out and flipped the red cardboard cover open. I stared down at the highly classified banking documents, wire transfer logs, and forged signature records Hector had managed to extract from the restricted banking servers. The sheer, staggering scale of the betrayal crystallized instantly before my eyes. Jalen had not simply squandered his generous monthly allowance to impress his manipulative fiancée. He had not merely overdrawn his platinum credit cards to buy expensive dinners and designer clothes. The stark black and white documents painted a horrifying, indisputable picture of a much darker reality. My son had weaponized his administrative access to execute a massive, highly illegal financial maneuver. He had committed blatant corporate fraud against Ellis Holdings. I sat in the absolute silence of my private study with Hector Silva's heavy red folder resting perfectly centered on my oak desk. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the stark white pages contained inside. I flipped open the cover and began to dissect the forensic financial evidence my investigator had meticulously assembled. The first page displayed a comprehensive summary of the subsidiary company's operating accounts. A glaring anomaly immediately commanded my attention. The numbers documented a massive, highly irregular cash infusion, followed by an equally rapid external transfer. I turned to the next page and discovered a formal lending agreement originated from a prominent commercial bank. The document detailed a newly issued corporate loan in the staggering amount of $300,000. The loan was explicitly secured against the physical assets and ironclad credit rating of Ellis Holdings. I ran my calloused index finger down to the bottom of the final page. A pristine, impeccably executed signature rested on the authorization line. It was my signature. The ink loops and sharp angles were flawlessly replicated to deceive the bank's underwriting department. My own son had practiced my handwriting, forged my name on a federal banking document, and illegally siphoned $300,000 of my capital. The severe nature of his actions instantly elevated the situation from a bitter family dispute to a major federal crime. Jalen had crossed a terminal boundary. I stared at the forged ink and remembered the specific day I created that subsidiary logistics firm. I established the small commercial fleet exactly 5 years ago. I handed the operational keys directly to Jalen to teach him the brutal, unforgiving realities of executive leadership. I wanted him to understand the heavy burden of managing payroll, negotiating vendor contracts, and balancing razor-thin profit margins. The company was designed to be his ultimate training ground, a place where he could earn his own respect through dedicated sweat equity. The forensic documents proved he abandoned that lesson entirely. Jalen weaponized the corporate seal to buy the hollow approval of Vanessa's elitist high society family. Hector's relentless paper trail exposed the ultimate destination of the stolen capital. Jalen executed a complex wire transfer to move the $300,000 into an obscure offshore shell account. That specific account belonged exclusively to Vanessa's father. The arrogant man who looked down on my blue-collar roots operated a supposedly prestigious commercial real estate firm. The financial reality painted a drastically different picture. His pristine legacy company was secretly failing bleeding cash and drowning in massive hidden liabilities. Jalen utilized my stolen capital to secretly bail out his future father-in-law. My son purchased his seat at their exclusive dinner table by sacrificing my hard-earned empire to save a family of desperate frauds. I did not pick up my phone to scream at Jalen. I did not waste my breath demanding explanations from a common thief. Confrontation is a useless tactic reserved for the weak and the emotional. Ruthless, definitive action is the only language recognized by the powerful. I placed the forged loan document flat against the leather surface of my desk. I opened my top drawer and pulled out my heavy black fountain pen. I bypassed the standard disciplinary procedures and drafted a formal executive order of total liquidation. As the sole proprietor and ultimate majority shareholder of Ellis Holdings, I possessed the absolute legal authority to dissolve any subordinate entity. I signed the heavy parchment with my genuine forceful signature. I scanned the binding legal directive and transmitted it instantly to my executive board of directors and my primary financial institutions. I ordered the immediate dissolution of Jalen's subsidiary logistics company. I mandated the total freeze of every single connected corporate asset, vehicle, fleet, and operating account. The financial artery feeding his treacherous existence was permanently severed at the source. The company ceased to exist within the span of 60 seconds. I executed the fatal blow to his stolen empire without uttering a single sound. The sudden massive corporate liquidation triggered an immediate chain reaction of automated security protocols within the federal banking system. Complex algorithms detected the extreme financial volatility and instantly flagged all connected external accounts for an emergency federal audit. The $300,000 resting in the shell account controlled by Vanessa's father was instantly frozen by government mandate. Across the city, the arrogant patriarch sat in his lavish corner office attempting to process the essential end-of-month payroll for his failing real estate firm. His chief financial officer burst through the heavy wooden doors to deliver the catastrophic news. Their primary operating accounts and hidden reserves were completely locked down. The desperate man stared at his computer screen in absolute horror as the bank traced the origin of the federal freeze directly back to the executive actions of Ellis Holdings. The secret bailout money had evaporated right out of his hands. The devastating reality of imminent bankruptcy crashed down upon his shoulders. Humiliated, panicked, and consumed by irrational rage, Vanessa's parents realized their carefully constructed high society illusion was completely destroyed. They abandoned their failing office building immediately. Driven by sheer desperation, the furious in-laws marched directly toward my corporate headquarters to demand the return of the stolen money. The heavy double doors of Ellis Holdings stand as a physical monument to 4 decades of unyielding labor. Richard and Eleanor Howell do not respect monuments. They do not respect labor. They respect only their own fabricated sense of elite authority. They march through the grand marble lobby with the blind confidence of people who have never been denied access to anywhere. They walk right past the bronze lettering bearing my family name. They walk right past the front security desk without a single glance at the uniformed guards. The head receptionist attempts to block their path. She asks for their names and their scheduled appointment time. Richard Howell dismisses her with a sharp wave of his manicured hand. He treats her like an invisible obstacle. He pushes past her desk and strides directly down the executive corridor. They throw open the frosted glass doors of my private office without a single knock. They bring the chaos of their collapsing world directly into the quiet sanctuary of my corporate headquarters. I sit behind my desk reviewing structural blueprints for a new commercial high-rise. I do not look up immediately. I make them wait. I force them to stand awkwardly on the imported rug while I finish reading the architectural notes. Eleanor taps her designer heel against the floorboards. Richard crosses his arms across his tailored suit. They project a massive aura of unearned superiority. They stand in a building financed by my sweat, yet they look down their noses as if they own the very air inside the room. They demand my immediate attention. They demand my absolute compliance. They demand that the blue-collar carpenter surrender to their high society demands. I slowly cap my fountain pen. I place it deliberately on the desk. I look up at the 2 desperate frauds standing in my office. Richard Howell slams both his hands flat onto the polished surface of my desk. He leans forward, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me. He does not know that a man who has framed houses in sub-zero winters cannot be intimidated by a soft man in an expensive suit. He demands that I immediately lift the federal freeze on his commercial operating accounts. He orders me to call my bankers and reverse the liquidation of the subsidiary company. He raises his voice, letting his arrogant commands echo off the wood-paneled walls. He tells me he knows exactly what I am doing. He calls me a bitter, jealous old man holding a pathetic grudge over a canceled wedding invitation. He claims my actions are a direct attack on his family's pristine legacy. He decides to escalate the situation by issuing a direct, calculated threat. He boasts about his deep political connections at City Hall. He names 2 city councilmen and a zoning commissioner who regularly attend his lavish dinner parties. He vows to weaponize those relationships against Ellis Holdings. He promises to arrange surprise municipal inspections at every single one of my active construction sites. He threatens to have my building permits permanently revoked. He swears he will bankrupt my entire construction empire within 6 months if I do not surrender the frozen capital back to his control. Eleanor stands beside him, nodding in smug agreement. She adds that my behavior is a massive embarrassment. She tells me I should be grateful they allowed my son to marry into their prestigious family. They use threats and insults to mask their profound, suffocating panic. They are drowning in debt, and they are threatening the only man holding a life raft. I listen to their loud, arrogant demands. I do not flinch. I do not argue. I do not raise my voice to counter his political threats. I do not defend my honor against Eleanor's elitist insults. I do not engage in a meaningless shouting match with a desperate coward. I remain perfectly seated in my heavy leather chair. I maintain steady, unblinking eye contact with Richard Howell. I reach out with my right hand and press a single silver button on the master intercom console resting on my desk. A highly amplified audio recording instantly fills the quiet executive office. The sound is crisp and undeniable. It is the voice of my son, Jalen. His voice cracks with heavy sobs and raw panic. The recording captures a private phone call between Jalen and an offshore loan officer. Jalen begs the officer for an emergency extension on a massive corporate debt. He cries hysterically into the receiver. He admits his devastating crime in plain, unmistakable English. Jalen confesses that he illegally siphoned $300,000 directly out of Ellis Holdings. He details the exact method he used to forge my signature on the federal lending documents. Then the recording delivers the ultimate fatal blow to the Howell family pride. Jalen tearfully admits the exact destination of the stolen capital. He states clearly that he funneled every single stolen dollar directly into Richard Howell's failing commercial real estate firm. He confesses that he orchestrated the massive corporate fraud to secretly bail out his bankrupt father-in-law. The recorded audio stops. The silence that follows is absolute and suffocating. The color instantly drains from Richard's face. His arrogant posture collapses. The smug, superior sneer vanishes from Eleanor's painted face. The horrific realization paralyzes them both. I possess irrefutable recorded proof of their direct complicity in a major federal crime. Their political connections cannot save them from a federal indictment. I open the top drawer of my desk and retrieve the red forensic folder provided by my investigator. I pull out the pristine, high-resolution copies of the forged loan documents. I toss the heavy stack of papers directly across the desk. The documents slide to a halt right in front of Richard's trembling hands. I look at the two terrified frauds standing before me. I deliver my final, non-negotiable ultimatum. I give them exactly 24 hours to wire the stolen $300,000 back into the Ellis Holdings master account. I state clearly that if the funds are not fully restored by this time tomorrow, I will personally hand the red folder and the audio recordings directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I promise them a highly public, deeply humiliating federal indictment. I assure them their pristine high society legacy will end in a federal penitentiary. I press the intercom button and instruct my security team to escort the trespassers out of my building. Richard and Eleanor grab the forged documents and stumble backward out of the office. They flee the corporate headquarters in a state of absolute blinding terror. Their fake empire is completely destroyed. They have no cash reserves, no liquid assets, and zero political leverage left. They speed back to the cramped, rented apartment where they now reside. They turn their furious desperation entirely onto Jalen. They corner my disgraced son. They scream at him to fix the apocalyptic disaster he created. They will not go to federal prison for his incompetence. They will not lose their freedom. They demand that Jalen secure the required capital immediately by any means necessary. Driven by profound terror and manipulative pressure from his in-laws, Jalen makes a fatal decision. He resolves to take drastic, highly illegal action against his own father. Jalen and Vanessa retreated to the cramped confines of a cheap rented room. The walls felt like a prison. The silence felt like a death sentence. They had no cash, no credit, and no immediate prospects. The crushing weight of their financial ruin drove them to ultimate treachery. Desperation breeds absolute malice. They decided to attack the very mind of the man who built their world. They drove to the state courthouse and filed an emergency medical guardianship petition. They filed a legal document to strip Byron Ellis of his basic human rights. They filed a declaration to erase his autonomy entirely. In the stark black and white text of the petition, they crafted a monstrous lie. They claimed Byron suffered from severe, rapidly advancing dementia. They claimed he was consumed by violent paranoia. They painted a tragic picture of an elderly man losing his grip on reality. They argued that his sudden decision to freeze accounts and cancel credit cards was the erratic behavior of a diseased mind. They stated that he posed a severe danger to himself and his vast corporate empire. They positioned themselves as the grieving, concerned family members stepping in to save him from his own mental decay. The strategy was incredibly cold. The strategy was incredibly calculated. The strategy was entirely built on absolute falsehoods. They intended to legally decapitate Ellis Holdings by removing the head of the company. If the state declared Byron legally incompetent, Jalen would automatically become the default financial guardian. Jalen would instantly inherit the master keys to the entire Ellis Holdings treasury. He would gain the immediate power to unfreeze the accounts, restore the subsidiary company, and erase the $300,000 deficit. He just needed the court to believe the devastating lie immediately. The heavy brass knocker on Byron's front door sounded a sharp, authoritative rhythm. A specialized legal courier stood on the porch under the morning sun. He handed Byron a thick manila envelope sealed with the official crest of the state family court. Byron accepted the package with steady, unmoving hands. He walked back into the absolute silence of his kitchen. He opened the envelope and spread the legal documents across the granite island. He read the official court summons commanding his mandatory appearance at a competency hearing. He read the devastating allegations leveled against his own mind. The sheer audacity of the assault crystallized on the second page. Jalen had not simply filed a baseless claim. Jalen had manufactured concrete, irrefutable medical evidence to support the lie. Attached to the petition was a sworn, notarized affidavit from a licensed medical professional. A prominent city psychiatrist had officially certified the false diagnosis. The doctor testified under oath that he had personally observed Byron exhibiting severe signs of cognitive decline, acute paranoia, and financial instability. The doctor recommended immediate institutionalization and the total transfer of all executive powers to his son. Byron recognized the name of the psychiatrist immediately. It was a man who frequently attended Vanessa's father's elite country club dinners. The connection was glaring. The corruption was undeniable. Jalen and Vanessa had bribed a medical professional to sign away a man's freedom. They purchased a fake medical history to steal a real corporate empire. They believed a signature on a piece of paper could erase 40 years of brilliant, calculated business acumen. They believed the court would simply look at an aging black man and accept the narrative of a decaying mind. They underestimated the formidable, calculating intellect of the man they were trying to bury alive. Byron did not yell at the empty walls of his house. Byron did not break under the crushing weight of his son's ultimate betrayal. Byron prepared for absolute legal war. He reached for his cell phone and dialed Jonathan Pierce. He did not waste time expressing sorrow or shock. He read the specific medical allegations aloud to his lead attorney. Jonathan recognized the severe legal threat instantly. A medical guardianship petition could temporarily freeze Ellis Holdings if a judge granted an emergency injunction. Byron issued a swift, uncompromising counter-directive. He commanded Jonathan to exploit the highest echelons of the state medical board immediately. Byron demanded the scheduling of 3 distinct exhaustive cognitive evaluations. He insisted these evaluations take place at the top 3 independent psychiatric hospitals in the entire state. He required the absolute best neurologists, the absolute best forensic psychiatrists, and the absolute best cognitive specialists money could buy. He wanted his brain mapped, tested, and certified by medical authorities whose reputations were entirely untouchable. He would construct a fortress of flawless medical data to crush the bribed doctor's flimsy affidavit. Jonathan mobilized the corporate legal team within seconds. He secured the necessary appointments by leveraging the immense financial power of Ellis Holdings. Byron dressed in his sharpest charcoal suit. He locked his front door and stepped into his waiting town car. He moved with the focused, chilling calm of a predator entering the final stage of a hunt. He was going to spend the next 48 hours navigating sterile hospital corridors and completing rigorous psychological examinations. He was going to secure the absolute proof of his own brilliant sanity. He was going to forge the precise medical weapons needed to legally execute his son in a court of law. While Byron sat in brightly lit examination rooms proving his undeniable sanity, Jalen watched the clock run out. Time became a physical, suffocating weight pressing against his chest. The 24-hour ultimatum to replace the stolen $300,000 had officially expired. The severe consequences of his corporate fraud materialized in the shadows of the city. Ruthless creditors from the offshore shell accounts began making direct, threatening phone calls. Violent loan sharks connected to his father-in-law's failing business started circling their cheap motel. They demanded immediate restitution. They promised severe physical violence if the massive debt remained unpaid. The walls closed in on Jalen completely. The guardianship petition would take weeks to process through the backlogged legal system. He needed untraceable cash right now. He needed a liquid asset immediately. Pure, blinding desperation drove him to cross the final unforgivable threshold. He knew his father was scheduled for multiple lengthy hospital evaluations across the state. He knew the large suburban house would remain completely empty for hours. Jalen drove a rented sedan to his childhood neighborhood and parked 2 blocks away. He crept through the familiar back alleys under the cover of the overcast afternoon. He bypassed the modern corporate security systems by relying on his intimate knowledge of the property. He approached the rear patio door. He intended to invade the sacred sanctuary of the man who gave him life. He intended to steal the one specific highly valuable item he knew his father kept hidden in the master bedroom. He intended to take the only untraceable asset left in the entire estate. He slipped his key into the old secondary lock, unaware that every single movement was actively triggering a silent, invisible alarm system directly connected to his father's secure mobile phone. I returned to the silent sanctuary of my estate as the evening shadows began to stretch across the manicured lawns. The exhaustive 48 hours of rigorous cognitive evaluations had completely drained my physical energy. My mind, however, remained incredibly sharp and absolutely vindicated. I possessed the undeniable medical certifications required to crush Jalen's fraudulent guardianship petition into dust. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the quiet foyer. The house felt exactly as I had left it, yet a strange, distinct tension lingered in the stagnant air. I walked up the sweeping mahogany staircase and headed directly toward my master bedroom. I needed to remove my tailored charcoal suit and prepare for the impending legal war. I pushed open the double doors of my bedroom and reached for the light switch. The soft illumination flooded the expansive space and instantly highlighted a glaring, violent intrusion. The custom-built wood paneling that seamlessly concealed my private wall safe hung awkwardly ajar. I walked across the plush carpet with measured, deliberate steps. My heart maintained a slow, steady rhythm, despite the obvious violation of my most private sanctuary. I reached out and pulled the wooden panel aside entirely. The heavy steel door of the biometric safe stood wide open. The electronic keypad was completely dark. Someone had bypassed the primary security measures with intimate, chilling precision. I leaned forward and looked directly into the dark velvet-lined interior. The space was completely stripped bare. The single most valuable, untraceable asset I owned was gone. The thief had operated with absolute certainty, knowing exactly where to look and exactly what to take. The violation was deeply personal, entirely calculated and executed with the cowardly efficiency of someone who intimately knew the layout of my life. The missing item was not a stack of emergency cash or a collection of anonymous bearer bonds. It was a custom-designed, flawless jade and diamond necklace valued at exactly $150,000. The monetary worth of the piece was entirely secondary to its profound historical significance. I purchased that specific necklace 30 years ago to celebrate a monumental milestone. Nadine and I had just closed our very first major commercial real estate flip. We had risked every single penny we owned to renovate a dilapidated warehouse block. The gamble paid off brilliantly, officially launching the unstoppable trajectory of Ellis Holdings. I placed that heavy jade pendant around my wife's neck to honor her unwavering faith in my blue-collar vision. Nadine wore it with immense pride. She called it our family crown jewel. When she passed away, I locked the necklace inside the master safe. It became a sacred relic. It was the physical embodiment of our shared sacrifice, our early struggles, and our ultimate triumph over poverty. Jalen understood the profound sentimental weight of that necklace better than anyone else on earth. He had watched his mother wear it during every significant family celebration. He knew it was the absolute last thing I would ever willingly surrender. Yet his panic had completely overridden his basic human decency. He did not see his mother's sacred legacy resting on that velvet shelf. He saw only a highly liquid, untraceable asset. He saw a quick, desperate solution to appease the violent loan sharks circling his pathetic motel room. He chose to pawn the literal foundation of our family history to protect the fraudulent lifestyle he had built for Vanessa. The theft was not an act of mere desperation. It was an act of profound, unforgivable desecration. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my jacket pocket and immediately launched the master security application. My estate is equipped with advanced invisible countermeasures that operate entirely independently from the visible alarm panels. A silent alert had been triggered the moment the secondary lock on the patio door was engaged. I tapped the screen and accessed the high-definition video archives. I pulled up the hidden camera feed positioned directly above the master bedroom doorframe. I watched the digital timestamp roll backward to the middle of the afternoon. The pristine footage played out in absolute agonizing clarity. I watched my own son creep into my bedroom like a common street thief. Jalen moved with frantic, jerky motions. He approached the concealed wall safe and punched a specific sequence of numbers into the keypad. He used his old childhood passcode. It was a sentimental numerical sequence I had never bothered to change because I never imagined I would need to lock my own son out of my life. The green access light flashed and the heavy steel door clicked open. I watched Jalen snatch the velvet box containing his mother's jade necklace. He did not hesitate. He did not look at the family photographs resting on the dresser. He shoved the box deep into his jacket pocket and sprinted out of the room. I switched the video feed to the external perimeter cameras. The wide-angle lens captured Jalen rushing down the back driveway toward a rented, unmarked sedan. The passenger side window rolled down as he approached. Vanessa sat waiting in the getaway car. Her face was tense with desperate anticipation. Jalen reached through the open window and handed his mother's priceless necklace directly to his manipulative bride. They sped away, carrying the soul of my family with them. I did not call Jalen's mobile phone to demand the necklace back. I did not send an angry text message threatening him with severe consequences. Screaming at a thief only gives them time to hide the stolen property. I operated with the cold mechanical precision of a man who had completely severed all emotional ties. I walked downstairs to my home office and booted up my secure desktop terminal. I extracted the high-definition video files from the cloud server and transferred the irrefutable evidence onto a portable encrypted hard drive. I compiled the original purchase receipts for the jade and diamond necklace, establishing its exact market value for the authorities. I placed the hard drive and the financial documentation into a pristine manila envelope. I walked out of my quiet house, climbed back into my waiting town car, and instructed my driver to head directly to the Central Police Precinct. I did not harbor a single ounce of hesitation. Jalen believed our shared bloodline would grant him absolute immunity from the law. He fundamentally believed I would tolerate grand larceny to avoid a public family scandal. He was entirely mistaken. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the police station and requested a meeting with the senior detective on duty. I placed the manila envelope firmly on the metal desk. I provided a formal, legally binding statement detailing the exact nature of the burglary. I surrendered the video evidence showing Jalen entering the safe and handing the stolen asset to Vanessa. I formally filed grand larceny charges against my own son and his newlywed wife. I authorized the immediate issuance of a federal arrest warrant. I transformed my treacherous son from a desperate corporate fraud into a highly pursued, wanted criminal before the sun even finished setting. Vanessa burst through the heavy glass doors of the downtown high-end pawn exchange. She did not walk with the graceful poise of a high society bride. She walked with the frantic, jerky urgency of a cornered animal. She marched directly to the reinforced glass counter and slammed the velvet box onto the polished surface. She slapped her palm against the glass. She slapped it hard. She slapped it to demand absolute immediate obedience from the man behind the counter. She pulled the flawless jade and diamond necklace from its casing and shoved it toward the broker. She demanded $80,000 in untraceable cash. She demanded the money instantly. She demanded the money to pay the exorbitant retainer fees for the defense attorneys who would keep her out of a federal penitentiary. The broker stared at her with practiced clinical detachment. He asked for her identification and the original certificate of provenance. Vanessa scoffed at his standard procedural questions. She wielded her unearned superiority like a blunt weapon. She told the broker she was Vanessa Howell. She told him her family practically owned the commercial real estate on this entire city block. She told him to skip the bureaucratic nonsense and fetch the cash from the back vault immediately. Her voice cracked with genuine suffocating panic. She needed that cash. She needed that cash to survive the impending legal apocalypse. She needed that cash to maintain the illusion of her elite status. The heavy jade stones gleamed under the harsh halogen lights of the shop. They represented 40 years of my family's sacrifice, and she was trying to liquidate my family's soul for a fraction of its worth just to save her own skin. The broker did not flinch at her shrill, demanding tone. He reached for the necklace with steady, gloved hands. He placed the heavy jade pendant under his high-powered magnifying loupe. He studied the intricate gold filigree. He studied the flawless diamond settings. He studied the unique serial number laser-etched onto the primary clasp. He recognized the piece immediately. He recognized it because he was a professional who monitored the secure federal database. He recognized it because my private investigator had blasted a high-priority stolen property bulletin to every licensed broker in the metropolitan area exactly 1 hour ago. The bulletin included a pristine photograph of the necklace, the exact serial number, and a direct warning regarding a federal grand larceny warrant. The broker knew he was holding a stolen masterpiece. He knew the frantic woman screaming at him was a wanted fugitive. He lowered his magnifying loupe and offered Vanessa a perfectly calm, entirely rehearsed smile. He told her the piece was magnificent. He told her the jade was of exceptional quality. He told her he needed to take the necklace into the secure back room to verify the diamond clarity under the spectrometer. Vanessa crossed her arms and tapped her designer shoe impatiently against the floor. She commanded him to hurry. The broker stepped away from the glass counter and walked into the reinforced back room. He closed the solid steel door behind him. He did not turn on the spectrometer. He reached under his desk and pushed the silent panic button connected directly to the local police precinct. He then flipped a secondary switch on the wall. The heavy magnetic locks on the front entrance engaged with a loud metallic clack. The trap was set. The trap was locked. The trap was completely inescapable. Vanessa was officially a prisoner of her own greed. The wail of police sirens pierced the quiet afternoon air. The sound grew louder. The sound grew sharper. The sound grew absolutely deafening as multiple patrol cars converged on the block. Red and blue lights reflected violently against the front windows of the pawn exchange. Vanessa spun around, dropping her designer handbag onto the linoleum floor. Her manufactured superiority evaporated in an instant. She ran to the heavy glass entrance and pushed against the handle. She pushed with all her might. She pushed until her perfectly manicured nails cracked against the thick glass. The magnetic locks held firm. 4 armed officers approached the entrance with their weapons drawn and ready. The broker released the magnetic seal from the safety of the back room. The officers burst into the shop with their hands resting on their duty belts. They commanded Vanessa to step away from the door. They commanded her to place her hands on her head. They commanded her to submit to the absolute authority of the law. I walked into the pawn shop right behind the tactical formation. I wore my tailored charcoal suit. I carried a single pristine manila envelope. I did not look at Vanessa with anger or pity. I looked at her with the cold, detached finality of an executioner. I stepped past her trembling body and approached the lead officer. I pulled a crisp, notarized document from my envelope. I handed the officer the original certificate of ownership for the jade and diamond necklace. The document bore my signature and my late wife's name. I stated for the official police record that the woman standing before them had conspired to burglarize my private estate. I stated that she had knowingly received stolen goods. I stated that I intended to prosecute her to the absolute fullest extent of the federal criminal code. The overwhelming reality of her situation finally shattered her fragile mind. The lead officer grabbed Vanessa by the wrists. He pulled her arms firmly behind her back. He pulled them hard. He pulled them until the cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply against her skin. The sharp metallic sound marked the definitive end of her high society illusion. She thrashed violently against the arresting officers. She screamed hysterical threats at the broker behind the glass. She screamed violent obscenities directly at me. Her expensive silk dress ripped at the shoulder as they dragged her forcefully out of the pawn shop and into the harsh afternoon daylight. A large crowd of downtown pedestrians gathered quickly on the sidewalk. They raised their smartphones high, eagerly recording the highly public, humiliating downfall of the arrogant heiress. The officers shoved her into the cramped, hard plastic backseat of the patrol cruiser. Vanessa managed to wriggle her bound hands toward her pocket. She somehow activated the voice dial feature on her smartwatch. The call connected to Jalen on speakerphone. Her voice echoed through the open door of the police car, raw and dripping with absolute venom. She did not ask her husband for help. She did not seek comfort from the man who had ruined his entire life to please her. She declared absolute unholy war on him. She screamed that she was sitting in handcuffs. She screamed that she was going to a federal prison. She screamed that she would never spend a single night in a jail cell for his pathetic botched robbery. She vowed to contact the district attorney the absolute second she arrived at the precinct. She promised to hand over every single piece of evidence regarding the forged corporate loans. She promised to testify against him in open federal court. She vowed to trade her useless, cowardly husband to the federal prosecutor in exchange for total legal immunity. Jalen's frantic, trembling voice called out her name from the tiny speaker, but the officer slammed the cruiser door shut, trapping him in his own nightmare. The midnight storm hammered the city with a relentless, freezing downpour. I watched the security monitors from the dry warmth of my private study. The high-definition infrared cameras captured a solitary figure standing outside the main iron gates of the Ellis estate. It was Jalen. He stood completely exposed to the violent weather, his thin designer jacket plastered to his shivering frame. The federal authorities had formally booked his bride into the county detention center 3 hours prior. The magistrate set Vanessa's preliminary bail at a non-negotiable $50,000 in cash. Jalen did not possess $50,000. He did not possess $50. I had successfully dismantled his entire financial infrastructure. The corporate subsidiary was fully liquidated. His platinum credit accounts were permanently suspended. The offshore shell accounts were entirely frozen by the federal bank audit. The ruthless loan sharks connected to the forged documents were actively hunting him across the city limits. He was trapped in a financial blackout of his own making. He pressed his face against the cold iron bars and stared up at the surveillance lens. The sheer desperation of a man entirely stripped of his unearned resources radiated through the digital feed. He had spent the last 36 months operating under the absolute delusion of his own invincibility. He believed he was a master manipulator capable of outsmarting the man who built an empire from dirt and concrete. Now the severe consequences of his profound arrogance had finally arrived. He was a fugitive standing in the freezing rain, entirely dependent on the mercy of the father he had actively conspired to destroy. He raised his fist and slammed it against the heavy metal gate. The hollow sound barely registered over the roaring thunder. I stepped out of the front door holding a large black umbrella against the driving rain. I walked down the long paved driveway with measured, deliberate steps. I did not rush to comfort my child. I commanded the security gate to slide open just enough to allow him entry. Jalen stumbled through the gap and immediately collapsed onto his knees against the wet asphalt. He did not stand like a man prepared to face the consequences of his own treachery. He groveled like a cornered coward. He stared up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. He begged for immediate financial salvation. He begged for the $50,000 required to secure Vanessa's release from federal custody. When I simply stared down at him in absolute silence, his frantic desperation instantly morphed into a pathetic display of betrayal. He initiated a total surrender of his own loyalties. He blamed Vanessa for the entire corporate fraud scheme. He claimed her insatiable greed drove him to forge the banking documents. He swore she aggressively manipulated his emotions to fund her failing father's business. He pointed a shaking finger toward the city and told me the robbery was entirely her idea. He claimed she forced him to memorize the safe combination and ordered him to steal the jade necklace under the explicit threat of canceling their wedding. He sacrificed the woman he had sworn to protect just 24 hours ago to save his own skin. He offered to sign any legal document I required. He promised to publicly testify against the Howell family in federal court. He begged for sanctuary inside my house, completely terrified of the violent creditors waiting for him in the shadows. He threw his own wife directly to the wolves in a desperate bid to regain my financial favor. I looked down at the pathetic, shivering man kneeling on my driveway. The rain washed the expensive styling product out of his hair and plastered his clothes to his trembling skin. I searched his frantic, terrified eyes for a single spark of honor. I looked for the resilient, blue-collar spirit I had spent decades trying to instill in his character. I found absolutely nothing. I saw no trace of my own blood. I saw no reflection of Nadine's unwavering loyalty. I saw only a weak, hollow shell of a man consumed by unchecked ambition and absolute cowardice. He had stolen my corporate capital, forged my legal signature, plotted to illegally strip me of my mental autonomy, and pawned his mother's sacred legacy. Now he was demonstrating the ultimate moral failure. I maintained my grip on the heavy umbrella and looked at him with cold, clinical detachment. I spoke with a quiet, devastating finality that easily pierced the noise of the storm. I told him that a man who willingly sells out his own wife to save his own neck possesses no value in this world. I stated clearly that his utter lack of loyalty was far more offensive to me than the stolen $300,000. I informed him that Ellis Holdings was built on an ironclad foundation of trust, accountability, and absolute resilience. He embodied the exact opposite of those principles. I told him he was no longer authorized to seek sanctuary on my property. I declared the ultimate termination of our relationship. I turned my back on him. I walked away, leaving him kneeling on the freezing pavement. I pressed the remote control in my pocket, and the heavy iron gates firmly clamped shut, sealing him permanently on the outside. Jalen let out a raw, guttural scream that echoed violently against the closed iron gates. The agonizing sound of total defeat was instantly swallowed by the heavy thunder rolling across the dark city skyline. He pounded his bare fists against the unyielding metal bars until his knuckles bled. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that my decision was permanent. The financial safety net he had relied on his entire life was completely gone. He had no allies, no legal defense, and no safe harbor left to hide from the vicious predators he owed money to. The profound terror of his impending reality rapidly transformed into a toxic, highly volatile rage. His pathetic weeping ceased abruptly. He pushed himself off the wet asphalt and stood upright in the freezing rain. Pure blinding desperation completely rewired his broken mind. He refused to accept his ultimate downfall. He refused to face a federal indictment and the violent retribution of the offshore loan sharks. He calculated his final, most dangerous maneuver. The emergency medical guardianship petition he and Vanessa had filed was still actively processing in the state court system. The mandatory competency hearing was scheduled to take place the very next morning at 10 o'clock. Jalen wiped the freezing rain from his face and cemented a fatal resolution. He decided his only viable path to survival was the total absolute destruction of my autonomy. He would walk into that courtroom and weaponize the bribed psychiatrist's fraudulent affidavit. He prepared to unleash a coordinated legal assault designed to legally strip me of my empire and lock me in a psychiatric ward permanently. He retreated to his rented sedan in the shadows, bracing himself for total war. The heavy oak doors of the state family court swung shut, sealing the tension inside the windowless room. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken hostility and the heavy anticipation of a brutal confrontation. Jalen sat beside his high-priced attorney, his posture rigid and his eyes darting frantically around the gallery. His tailored suit was perfectly pressed, a desperate, calculated attempt to mask the absolute financial and legal ruin waiting for him outside the courthouse walls. I sat completely still on the opposite side of the aisle. My lead counsel, Jonathan Pierce, arranged a single stack of pristine folders on our table without a trace of anxiety. The presiding judge struck his gavel and signaled the immediate commencement of the emergency medical guardianship hearing. Jalen's attorney rose from his leather chair to deliver a highly dramatized, venomous opening statement. He paced in front of the judge's bench and launched into a meticulously rehearsed narrative of tragedy and filial duty. He painted me not as a successful corporate titan, but as a violent, deeply confused elder completely divorced from reality. He claimed that my sudden massive corporate liquidations and the freezing of the subsidiary accounts were the erratic, dangerous tantrums of a diseased mind. He twisted the events of the previous 24 hours to fit his fabricated timeline perfectly. He boldly stated that I had suffered a severe psychotic break and hallucinated a grand larceny to punish a loving, devoted son. He argued that Jalen had simply arrived at my estate the previous night to offer emotional support, only to be chased away by a paranoid tyrant suffering from acute delusions. The attorney implored the court to intervene before my fabricated mental decay destroyed the Ellis Holdings empire entirely. Jalen bowed his head during the speech, performing the role of the heartbroken, dutiful heir with sickening dedication. The prosecution immediately called their primary expert witness to the stand to validate their fabricated claims. A distinguished, silver-haired psychiatrist walked confidently to the witness box. This was the exact same doctor who frequented the elite country clubs favored by Vanessa's disgraced father. He wore an expensive imported suit and exuded an aura of absolute medical authority. He swore the official oath, placed his hand on the holy text, and immediately proceeded to lie under the direct threat of perjury. He opened his medical portfolio and began to recite his fraudulent clinical observations. He spoke with a soft, practiced cadence designed to mimic deep professional empathy. He testified that he had conducted a comprehensive behavioral analysis of my recent actions and corporate directives. He stated with unwavering professional conviction that I was suffering from rapid onset advanced paranoia and severe cognitive deterioration. He deliberately twisted my decisive corporate maneuvers into classic symptoms of a deteriorating executive brain. He claimed my refusal to engage in emotional outbursts or communicate directly with my son was definitive proof of pathological detachment. The doctor looked directly at the presiding judge and delivered his final, devastating recommendation. He insisted that my continued freedom posed an imminent physical and financial danger to myself and my entire corporate staff. He formally advised the court to order my immediate institutionalization in a secure long-term psychiatric facility. He then recommended the immediate total transfer of all executive and financial powers directly to Jalen. He argued that my son was the only competent family member capable of steering Ellis Holdings away from total collapse. Jalen nodded sorrowfully from his seat, projecting the image of a reluctant savior forced into an impossible position. The doctor smiled a tight, confident smile, absolutely certain that his purchased authority was completely unassailable. Jonathan Pierce did not object during the fraudulent testimony. He allowed the corrupt psychiatrist to dig his own grave with every single uttered lie. When the opposing counsel finally concluded their direct examination, Jonathan stood up and approached the center of the courtroom. He carried no dramatic flair or emotional outrage. He carried only the absolute devastating truth. Jonathan approached the judge's bench and submitted 3 thick sealed medical dossiers into the official court record. He announced clearly that these documents contain the results of 3 independent, exhaustive cognitive evaluations conducted over the past 48 hours. He explicitly noted that these evaluations were performed by the chief neurologists at the top 3 independent psychiatric hospitals in the state. He read the unanimous clinical conclusions aloud for the entire court to hear. The leading medical experts in the region certified that my cognitive function, executive reasoning, and psychological stability were absolutely flawless. The pristine medical data instantly shattered the bribed doctor's flimsy narrative. Jonathan then pivoted to execute the fatal blow. He pulled a single subpoenaed banking record from his briefcase and projected it onto the courtroom evidence monitor. The digital document displayed a recent highly illegal wire transfer. The undeniable financial log showed Jalen transferring exactly $25,000 directly from a hidden offshore account into the testifying psychiatrist's private island registry. Jonathan stated for the record that this transaction occurred exactly 12 hours before the doctor filed the initial guardianship affidavit. The paper trail was absolute and completely undeniable. Jalen had directly purchased his father's fake diagnosis with stolen capital. The esteemed medical professional sitting in the witness box instantly turned the color of ash. His arrogant posture crumbled under the blinding light of the projected evidence. Jonathan had not merely defended my sanity. He had completely annihilated their entire conspiracy with clinical lethal precision. The presiding judge stared at the illuminated banking record and the flawless, independent medical evaluations. The sheer audacity of the conspiracy committed inside his own courtroom ignited a terrifying judicial fury. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a force that echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. His voice boomed across the microphone as he immediately struck the entire emergency guardianship petition from the official state record. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the pale, sweating psychiatrist in the witness box. The judge held the disgraced medical professional in immediate direct contempt of court and signaled the bailiffs to detain him. He then turned his blistering wrath onto Jalen. The judge officially ordered the state prosecutor to launch an immediate comprehensive perjury and conspiracy investigation into my son. He warned Jalen that attempting to weaponize the family court system for financial theft was a severe felony that would be prosecuted without a single shred of mercy. The looming threat of decades in federal prison completely fractured Jalen's remaining sanity. The crushing financial blockade, the highly public pawnshop arrest of his wife, and the total collapse of his legal coup converged into a singular point of absolute terror. He looked at me one final time, desperately searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. He looked at the armed bailiffs advancing toward the witness stand and realized he was entirely out of options. Driven by pure, blinding panic, Jalen shoved his chair backward. It crashed violently onto the polished marble floor. He ignored the frantic shouts of his own defense attorney. He bolted down the center aisle, shoved open the heavy oak doors, and fled the courthouse into the crowded city streets. He was no longer a corporate executive or a dutiful son. He was a desperate, hunted fugitive rapidly running out of places to hide. The cold, damp air of the county detention center clung to Vanessa as she walked through the heavy steel release doors. Her prominent, status-obsessed parents had mortgaged their remaining properties and drained their depleted savings accounts to scrape together the $50,000 cash bond. They purchased her temporary freedom at the absolute brink of their own financial ruin. They sacrificed their retirement. They sacrificed their social standing. They sacrificed everything to keep their daughter out of a federal jumpsuit. Vanessa did not offer them tears of gratitude. She did not express remorse for dragging her family name through the mud of a public booking facility. She felt only a burning, consuming rage directed entirely at the man who had failed to provide the bulletproof shield he promised. She stood on the wet concrete steps of the precinct and immediately initiated her ruthless counteroffensive. She turned to the high-priced defense attorney her father had secured. She demanded the immediate drafting of an emergency divorce petition. She demanded the immediate severing of all legal ties to Jalen Ellis. She demanded the immediate erasure of his surname from her pristine identity. She viewed Jalen no longer as a husband, no longer as an equal partner, and certainly no longer as a meal ticket. She viewed him as a highly toxic liability. He was a sinking ship. He was a burning building. He was a dead weight pulling her down into the abyss of a federal indictment. She instructed her attorney to frame the divorce around severe fraud, emotional manipulation, and financial coercion. She intended to cast herself as the ultimate unsuspecting victim of a master manipulator. She intended to sacrifice the man she married to ensure she walked away with her reputation completely intact. Vanessa returned to the sterile confines of the precinct interrogation room less than an hour after her initial release. She sat across a battered metal table from two seasoned federal detectives. She did not request a glass of water. She did not ask for a moment to compose her frayed nerves. She did not shed a single tear for her ruined marriage. She projected the polished, untouchable poise of a woman who had completely detached herself from any concept of marital loyalty. Her defense attorney sat rigidly by her side, brokering the terms of her absolute betrayal. The lead detective placed a formal typed statement on the table. Vanessa picked up a cheap plastic pen and began to sing. She sang a meticulously crafted song of total innocence. She formally named Jalen Ellis as the sole autonomous mastermind behind the corporate forgery. She explicitly detailed how he single-handedly orchestrated the illegal liquidation of the subsidiary accounts. She swore under oath that he had manipulated her into acting as an unwitting courier for the stolen jade and diamond necklace. She claimed he had violently threatened her into presenting the stolen heirloom at the downtown pawn exchange. She painted every single illegal maneuver as his exclusive, desperate obsession. She traded every shared secret, every whispered plan, and every illicit transaction for her own survival. The detectives listened with cold, clinical satisfaction as she systematically dismantled her husband's entire life. She signed her name at the bottom of the multi-page confession with a sharp, decisive stroke. Her signature officially secured her full transactional immunity from the state prosecutor. She purchased her absolute freedom using the total legal annihilation of her husband as the currency. She walked out of the interrogation room completely clean, leaving Jalen to face the full wrath of the justice system alone. The ink on the immunity agreement was barely dry when Vanessa launched her secondary assault. She believed securing her physical freedom was only the first half of the battle. She fully expected a massive financial payout to compensate for her emotional trauma. Her divorce attorney dispatched a highly aggressive, legally binding demand letter directly to my corporate headquarters. The document demanded an immediate audit of Jalen's personal estate. The document demanded a comprehensive accounting of his executive trust fund. The document demanded exactly 50% of his accumulated corporate wealth as an emergency spousal support settlement. Vanessa still operated under the profound delusion that she had married into boundless, untouchable royalty. I received the demand letter while sitting at my mahogany desk. I did not summon my legal team to negotiate a private settlement. I did not entertain the idea of paying a single cent of extortion money to the woman who had tried to fence my dead wife's necklace. I instructed my chief financial officer to compile a certified, brutally transparent accounting profile of Jalen's current financial standing. I sent the certified ledger back to her attorney via a specialized legal courier. The documents contained no complex legal jargon. The documents contained no room for negotiation. The documents contained only stark, indisputable mathematics. The ledger proved that Jalen possessed zero corporate equity. The ledger proved his executive accounts were entirely frozen. The ledger proved he had personally absorbed the $300,000 deficit from the forged loans. His official net worth was completely obliterated. It was a massive, crushing negative figure. He was technically, legally, and functionally bankrupt. Vanessa tore open the courier package, expecting the master keys to a vast treasury. She found only a certified confirmation of absolute poverty. She realized with blinding, infuriating clarity that she was walking away from the marriage with absolutely nothing. Jalen sprinted through the labyrinth of the city's industrial district, his lungs burning with the agonizing fire of total panic. He was completely cut off from the civilized world. He was a ghost running through a landscape that offered absolutely no sanctuary. The federal arrest warrant for grand larceny, corporate fraud, and perjury was actively blinking on every police dashboard in the tri-state area. His face was plastered across the digital network of law enforcement. He could not access a single hotel room. He could not withdraw a single dollar for a hot meal. He could not call the woman he had ruined himself for. The crushing news of Vanessa's total immunity deal had already trickled down through the frantic whispers of his former corporate associates. His own wife had legally executed him to save her immaculate reputation. The ultimate betrayal completely shattered his remaining psychological defenses. He huddled behind a rusted dumpster, shivering violently in the damp, freezing shadows. The police cruisers slowly patrolling the perimeter avenues were suddenly the least of his terrifying problems. The ruthless offshore creditors who had financed his fraudulent corporate loans realized the money was never coming back. They bypassed the slow bureaucratic process of the civil court system entirely. They unleashed their own private, highly specialized debt collectors into the city streets. These were men who operated entirely outside the boundaries of the law. These were men who did not care about federal warrants or family court dramas. These were men who collected outstanding corporate debts in blood and broken bones. Jalen heard the slow, heavy crunch of heavy boots stepping onto the gravel at the far end of the alleyway. He was completely surrounded by flashing police lights on the main avenue and violent predators closing in from the shadows. The trap was finally irreversibly shut. Jalen retreated to the absolute edge of the city limits. He paid for a decaying cash-only motel room under a fabricated name using the last few crumpled bills in his leather wallet. The walls were stained with decades of neglect. The flickering neon sign outside buzzed with a rhythmic, maddening electrical hum. He sat on the edge of a sunken spring-bare mattress, staring blindly at the dark television screen. The active federal warrants, the completely frozen bank accounts, and his wife's devastating immunity deal played on a continuous, agonizing loop inside his shattered mind. He had traded his birthright for an illusion of power, and now he possessed absolutely nothing. The heavy rain continued to assault the fragile structure of the motel, perfectly masking the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching his door. The violent reality of his forged corporate loans materialized without a single second of warning. A solid wooden baseball bat shattered the cheap glass of the motel window. Shards of jagged glass exploded across the filthy, worn carpet. Before Jalen could even process the breach, the heavy wooden door buckled under an immense, brutal force. The door frame splintered entirely, ripping the deadbolt from the rotting wood. Two massive, broad-shouldered men stepped into the cramped space. They did not wear police badges. They did not carry legal subpoenas. They wore heavy leather jackets soaking wet from the storm and carried the distinct menacing aura of professional, highly violent debt collectors. These were the ghosts representing the offshore shell accounts. They had come to collect the $300,000 Jalen had squandered on Vanessa's manufactured lifestyle. The larger of the two men kicked a wooden chair out of his path. He did not ask for a bank transfer. He raised the heavy wooden bat, preparing to extract the corporate debt directly from Jalen's bones. Pure primal adrenaline bypassed Jalen's paralyzed cognitive reasoning instantly. As the massive enforcer swung the heavy wooden bat toward his skull, Jalen threw his body backward across the decaying mattress. The bat smashed directly into the television screen, sending a shower of bright sparks and shattered plastic flying into the damp air. Jalen scrambled frantically across the floor on his hands and knees. He hurled himself into the tiny, filthy bathroom and violently slammed the hollow door shut. He heard the heavy boots charging after him, shaking the floorboards. He did not waste a fraction of a second searching for a weapon. He threw his entire body weight against the frosted glass of the narrow bathroom window. The rusted metal frame gave way with a loud crunch. Jalen tumbled out into the freezing, muddy alleyway behind the motel. Jagged glass sliced deep into his forearms and tore through his expensive designer jacket, but the searing pain barely registered against the absolute terror gripping his heart. He heard the bathroom door splinter behind him. He scrambled to his feet and ran blindly into the stormy night. He sprinted through flooded back alleys, leaping over overflowing trash bins and slipping on slick oil-stained pavement. His lungs burned with absolute agony. Warm blood dripped steadily from his lacerated arms, mixing with the freezing rain. He knew he could not outrun professional hunters in the open city streets. He needed an impenetrable sanctuary. He needed a structural fortress. His panicked mind locked onto the only truly secure location he had ever known. He changed his trajectory and sprinted directly toward the commercial industrial district. He navigated the treacherous urban terrain and headed straight for the Ellis Holdings main distribution warehouse, desperately hoping the automated perimeter defenses would offer him immediate salvation from the violent predators hunting him down. The massive, block-long structure of the Ellis Holdings distribution warehouse loomed in the distance against the dark sky. The perimeter was ringed by heavy steel fencing and high-intensity security floodlights. Jalen bypassed the primary electronic gate by sliding through a narrow, overgrown drainage culvert he remembered from his teenage years working summer inventory shifts. He stumbled across the flooded loading dock, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He approached the main executive entrance. The towering double doors were constructed of solid, reinforced, bulletproof glass. The expansive lobby beyond the glass was completely illuminated, casting a harsh white glow out into the stormy night. Jalen threw his bloody hands against the cold, unyielding barrier. He pushed against the heavy metal handles, but the biometric magnetic locks held with absolute, terrifying permanence. He peered through the thick glass, desperately scanning the pristine lobby for a night security guard. Instead, he saw a solitary figure standing perfectly still in the center of the polished marble floor. It was his father. Byron Ellis stood in his immaculate charcoal suit, his hands resting calmly at his sides. Jalen slammed his fists against the bulletproof glass. The heavy impacts left smeared, bloody handprints across the pristine, transparent surface. He screamed into the freezing rain. He screamed for his father to recognize him. He screamed for immediate protection. He screamed that ruthless killers were only minutes away from ending his life in the dark parking lot. He begged for the magnetic locks to release. He promised absolute subservience to the company. He promised to publicly confess to every single corporate crime and serve his prison sentence without a fight. He begged the man he had actively tried to destroy to grant him immediate life-saving sanctuary from the monsters closing in behind him. Byron did not move a single muscle. He stood firmly anchored to the marble floor of the corporate empire he had built from absolute nothingness. He looked through the thick smeared glass at the frantic, bleeding man outside. He did not see a son seeking genuine forgiveness. He saw the ultimate manifestation of unchecked greed and profound disloyalty. He watched Jalen's terrified face contort as the dark shadows of the approaching loan sharks began to stretch across the wet pavement of the loading dock. Byron reached smoothly into his tailored jacket. He withdrew his encrypted smartphone. He did not unlock the reinforced doors to shield a corporate traitor. He bypassed his private security team entirely and dialed the direct emergency line for the city police department. He spoke with the cold, measured cadence of a chief executive reporting a minor logistical issue. He provided the exact address of the commercial warehouse. He reported a highly aggressive, bleeding vagrant actively attempting to breach his secure corporate facility. He explicitly mentioned that the individual was acting with extreme hostility and required immediate apprehension. Byron disconnected the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. He remained entirely motionless, watching the inevitable conclusion of Jalen's catastrophic choices. The wail of police sirens instantly overpowered the rumbling thunder. 3 patrol cruisers accelerated around the warehouse corner, their blinding headlights sweeping across the loading dock. The heavy vehicles skidded to a halt directly behind Jalen, scattering the advancing debt collectors into the surrounding darkness. Before Jalen could even turn around to surrender, 4 armed officers swarmed him. They tackled his exhausted, battered body straight down onto the freezing concrete. As the officers locked the heavy steel cuffs around his bleeding wrists, Jalen looked up through the rain and saw his father slowly turn his back and walk away into the brilliant light of the fortress. The severe financial hemorrhage initiated by Vanessa's $50,000 cash bond completely drained the Howell family's remaining liquid assets. Arthur and Eleanor Howell had recklessly mortgaged their private estate and emptied their heavily depleted retirement portfolios to spare their daughter the extreme indignity of a federal holding cell. They operated under the profound delusion that their societal standing would magically replenish their empty coffers and protect them from ruin. They were catastrophically mistaken. The morning after Vanessa walked free from the county detention center, a specialized legal courier arrived at the towering iron gates of the Howell family estate. He handed Arthur a thick, heavily sealed envelope bearing the imposing crest of a massive anonymous corporate holding conglomerate. Arthur tore open the heavy paper package with violently trembling hands. The document inside was a final non-negotiable foreclosure notice. Their multi-generational family enterprise, a prestigious commercial real estate firm that had exclusively funded their elite, highly leveraged lifestyle for decades, was officially in total default. The corporate entity holding their massive toxic debt had initiated immediate seizure protocols. The Howells had 0 days left to rectify the staggering balance. They had absolutely no cash reserves left to mount a viable legal defense. The crushing reality of their situation crashed down upon them with suffocating weight. Vanessa's boundless arrogance and their own blind financial enabling had cost them their entire legacy. They stared at the stark black and white text detailing their absolute financial execution. The faceless corporate entity demanded the immediate surrender of their commercial properties, their remaining company vehicles, and their sprawling executive office building. They were completely broke and facing public humiliation on a scale they had never thought possible. Arthur and Eleanor fiercely refused to accept absolute defeat. They had spent their entire lives navigating high society, firmly believing that personal charm, strategic connections, and inherent white privilege could effortlessly erase any financial indiscretion. They resorted to the only survival tactic they knew. They dressed for a war of visual intimidation. Arthur donned his finest bespoke navy suit, polishing his heavy gold cufflinks to a flawless mirror shine. Eleanor clasped her grandmother's authentic heavy pearls around her neck and slipped into a perfectly tailored designer dress. They intended to walk directly into the corporate headquarters of the faceless entity holding their debt and negotiate a generous grace period face to face. They climbed into their leased luxury sedan and drove rapidly toward the towering glass and steel skyscraper dominating the downtown financial district. During the agonizing drive, they meticulously rehearsed their charm offensive. They planned to leverage their old money surname. They planned to mention shared acquaintances at the elite country club. They were absolutely confident they could sit across from a corporate board of directors and smile their way out of total bankruptcy. They believed their refined accents and manicured appearances would inherently demand immediate respect and leniency from the debt holders. They parked in the VIP executive garage and walked into the pristine marble-floored lobby with their heads held high in an act of pure desperation. They approached the front desk with an air of expected deference, demanding an immediate audience with the chief executive officer handling their foreclosure portfolio. The receptionist did not ask them to wait. She did not ask for their credentials. She simply nodded silently and handed them a secure magnetic keycard for the private penthouse elevator. The silent, high-speed elevator ascended directly to the top floor of the towering corporate structure. The polished steel doors glided open, revealing a sprawling executive boardroom bathed in harsh natural light. Arthur and Eleanor stepped onto the plush carpet, instantly intimidated by the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding them. The room was dominated by a massive, highly polished mahogany conference table. At the far end of the table, an imposing figure sat in a high-backed leather chair, perfectly silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The executive was reviewing two specific digital acquisition files, clearly labeled on his monitor as Kichban Ongdaden 2_15.docs and Kichban Ongdaden Mao 1_15.docx. Arthur cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie as he prepared to launch into his heavily rehearsed monologue of societal entitlement. He opened his mouth to introduce his prestigious family name and demand a structural reorganization of his commercial debt. Before a single word could escape his lips, the heavy leather chair slowly swiveled around. The breath violently left Arthur's lungs. Eleanor instinctively took a stumbling step backward, raising a trembling hand to her pearl necklace. Sitting in the center of the corporate empire that now owned their entire lives was Byron Ellis. He wore an immaculate charcoal suit. His posture was utterly relaxed, projecting the terrifying calm of an apex predator who had successfully cornered his prey. The faceless corporate entity that had ruthlessly bought up the Howell family debt was merely a hidden subsidiary arm of Ellis Holdings. Byron steepled his fingers and stared directly into the terrified eyes of the people who had tried to destroy his son. Byron did not raise his voice. He did not gloat over their magnificent downfall. He delivered the fatal blow with the cold, measured cadence of a master executioner. He informed Arthur and Eleanor that he had spent the last 48 hours actively purchasing their toxic commercial debt from 3 separate regional banks. He acquired their entire generational legacy for absolute pennies on the dollar. He now held the exclusive, undeniable legal right to liquidate their commercial firm, seize their remaining physical assets, and forcefully evict them from their heavily mortgaged suburban estate. The horrific realization paralyzed the Howells. The perfectly tailored suits and expensive pearls suddenly felt like heavy funeral shrouds. Their manufactured superiority completely evaporated in the freezing air of the boardroom. They looked at the formidable, brilliant man sitting behind the mahogany desk. This was the exact same man they had openly mocked in the privacy of their country club dining rooms. This was the man they had deemed entirely unworthy to receive an invitation to their daughter's lavish wedding. They had looked at a self-made black billionaire and seen only a blue-collar worker they could easily exclude from their elite societal circles. Now their entire existence, their freedom, and their legacy rested exclusively in his unforgiving hands. Byron leaned forward and slid the final foreclosure documents across the polished table. He stated clearly that he would not grant a single day of leniency. He would not accept their frantic, desperate apologies. He intended to dismantle their family enterprise brick by brick exactly as they had allowed their daughter to dismantle his own family. The Howells were no longer high society elites. They were entirely destitute, legally ruined, and absolutely powerless against the man they had foolishly chosen to underestimate. Arthur Howell's perfectly cultivated high society facade disintegrated entirely under the fluorescent lights of the boardroom. The arrogant posture that had defined his entire existence collapsed into a pathetic, trembling slouch. He stared at Byron Ellis, his jaw working frantically as he struggled to process the sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin. The heavy gold cufflinks on his wrists suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry. He opened his mouth, but the commanding voice of a wealthy patriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, wet stammer. Arthur leaned forward, pressing his manicured hands flat against the mahogany table. He began to beg for mercy with the sickening urgency of a cornered animal. He offered a stream of hollow, frantic apologies designed to rewrite history. He claimed the decision to exclude Byron from the wedding was a terrible miscommunication. He swore they had always harbored the utmost respect for the Ellis family name. Eleanor wept openly beside him, her carefully applied makeup running down her pale cheeks as she pleaded for compassion. Arthur promised to restructure their firm to offer Byron a seat on their board, to do absolutely anything to salvage their generational legacy. He groveled before the man he had spent years dismissing as a blue-collar subordinate. Byron listened to the pathetic symphony of their humiliation in complete, unbroken silence. He did not smile. He did not nod. He let Arthur exhaust his vocabulary of empty promises. When the older man finally paused to draw a ragged breath, Byron raised a single steady hand. The gesture was incredibly slight, yet it commanded absolute authority. Arthur snapped his mouth shut instantly. The sprawling executive boardroom fell into a suffocating, deathly silence. Byron looked directly into Arthur's terrified eyes, stripping away the last remaining shreds of the Howell family dignity. Byron folded his hands together and leaned forward, bringing his face into the harsh light of the city windows. He spoke with the cold, measured precision of a surgeon operating on a fatal tumor. He informed Arthur that his apologies were as worthless as his heavily mortgaged commercial real estate portfolio. Byron stated that he had not purchased their toxic debt to entertain partnerships or listen to fabricated regrets. He had purchased their debt to execute a flawless financial correction. Byron reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a single pristine legal document. He slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of Arthur's trembling hands. Byron outlined two absolute, non-negotiable options. The first option was a demand for immediate liquid restitution. Arthur had exactly 24 hours to wire $300,000 directly into the primary treasury of Ellis Holdings. Byron explicitly noted that this was the precise sum of money Jalen and Vanessa had stolen from his corporate subsidiary to illegally prop up the failing Howell enterprise. If Arthur could produce the cash, the foreclosure would be temporarily suspended. The second option was the immediate, unconditional surrender of his entire legacy. If Arthur could not produce the cash by the following morning, he must sign the transfer deed resting on the table right now. Signing the document would legally forfeit total ownership of the Howell commercial real estate firm, its associated properties, and its remaining liquid assets directly to Byron Ellis. There would be no grace periods. There would be no payment plans. There would be no lengthy civil court battles. Byron placed an expensive fountain pen on top of the document. He instructed Arthur to evaluate his empty bank accounts and make a definitive choice before standing up from the chair. Arthur stared at the heavy fountain pen as if it were a loaded weapon. A choked, agonizing sob escaped Eleanor's throat. The mathematical reality of their situation offered absolutely no escape route. The Howells did not possess $300,000. They did not possess $3,000. They had completely drained their personal savings, liquidated their retirement portfolios, and leveraged their private estate to the absolute maximum limit just to post Vanessa's exorbitant federal bail bond. They were completely, irrevocably bankrupt. Arthur slowly raised his eyes to meet Byron's unyielding gaze. He looked for a fraction of sympathy and found only a flawless reflection of his own past cruelty. The absolute defeat crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. His shoulders slumped forward. He reached out with a violently shaking hand and picked up the silver pen. He uncapped it and pressed the nib against the crisp white paper. Arthur Howell signed his signature on the dotted line, legally surrendering the entirety of his grandfather's commercial firm to the man he had barred from his daughter's wedding. He signed away his societal standing, his corporate power, and his financial future in 3 quick, devastating strokes. He pushed the signed deed back across the table, weeping silently into his hands. Byron picked up the document and inspected the signature with clinical detachment. He placed the deed inside his briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. Byron stood up from the executive chair and adjusted his tailored jacket. He looked down at the weeping couple and delivered his final corporate directive. He informed Arthur and Eleanor that they were officially trespassing on private property owned by Ellis Holdings. He fired them both on the spot, revoking their executive access, their company vehicles, and their corporate pensions. He instructed them to vacate the building immediately or face forceful removal by armed security. The brutal efficiency of the corporate takeover triggered a rapid, humiliating chain reaction. Less than 48 hours after Arthur signed the transfer deed, a team of county sheriffs arrived at the massive iron gates of the Howell family estate. They carried a judicially approved absolute eviction order. The bank had seized the sprawling suburban mansion to cover the remaining personal debts. Vanessa, Arthur, and Eleanor were forced out of their luxurious sanctuary under the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. The elite neighbors they had desperately tried to impress now stood on their manicured lawns, watching the spectacular downfall of the Howell dynasty with quiet, fascinated judgment. The disgraced family did not load their belongings into a fleet of professional moving vans. They could only afford a cheap rented box truck. Vanessa dragged heavy garbage bags filled with designer clothes across the damp grass, her pristine reputation entirely shattered. Eleanor wept as she watched the bank's foreclosure sign being hammered into the front lawn. Arthur loaded cardboard boxes into the back of the rented truck, his back bent under the crushing weight of his absolute failure. They drove away from their former kingdom destitute and entirely exiled from high society. While the Howells vanished into the obscure margins of the city, a much darker, far more severe reckoning approached. Deep inside the maximum security wing of the Federal Detention Center, Jalen Ellis sat perfectly still on a hard metal cot. The heavy steel doors of his cell block slammed shut, echoing down the sterile concrete hallway. The calendar pages had turned with merciless speed. The preliminary hearings were over. The grand jury had officially returned a comprehensive multi-count indictment. The sun was rising on the first day of his criminal trial, bringing him face to face with the absolute destruction he had engineered. The harsh fluorescent lights of the federal courtroom offered no shadows for Jalen to hide within. He sat rigidly at the polished oak defense table, a hollow shell of the corporate prince he had pretended to be just weeks earlier. His tailored luxury suits had been permanently confiscated, replaced by the stark, humiliating orange fabric of a county detention uniform. The lead federal prosecutor paced methodically before the jury box, laying out the absolute devastation of Jalen's choices with surgical precision. The criminal charges echoed through the cavernous room like successive hammer blows. Grand larceny, corporate fraud, aggravated perjury. The state did not rely on emotional appeals to secure a conviction. They relied on a mountainous, impenetrable fortress of digital and physical evidence. The prosecutor projected the forged loan authorizations onto a massive courtroom monitor, clearly highlighting Jalen's manipulated signatures. The financial ledgers tracing the stolen $300,000 to the offshore shell accounts were distributed to the jury in meticulously tabbed binders. High-definition security footage from the downtown pawn exchange played on a continuous loop, completely obliterating any remaining shred of deniability regarding the stolen jade and diamond necklace. Jalen's court-appointed public defender sat silently beside him, offering absolutely no objections. There was simply nothing left to object to. Vanessa's ruthless immunity deal had provided the prosecution with a flawlessly detailed roadmap of the entire conspiracy. Every lie Jalen had ever told was systematically dismantled and laid bare for the public record. He stared at the damning exhibits, feeling the sheer, crushing weight of federal prison closing in around him. The illusion of his absolute invincibility had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified man facing decades of caged isolation. Desperation consumed Jalen as the prosecutor concluded his opening onslaught. He turned his head away from the damning evidence monitor and frantically scanned the crowded public gallery. He searched the sea of journalists, court clerks, and strangers for a single familiar face. He searched for the ultimate safety net he had taken for granted his entire life. He desperately looked for Byron. Throughout Jalen's privileged childhood and early adulthood, his father had served as an impenetrable shield against the consequences of failure. When a teenage Jalen wrecked an expensive sports car, Byron quietly settled the damages. When Jalen blundered his early corporate assignments, Byron discreetly absorbed the financial losses and shielded his son's professional reputation. Jalen clung to the irrational, consuming hope that his father would execute one final miracle. He prayed to see a team of elite, high-priced defense attorneys striding through the heavy wooden doors to hijack the proceedings. He begged the universe for his father to approach the judge's bench, lay down a blank check, and broker a miraculous plea deal. He wanted Byron to take the witness stand and deliver a commanding character reference that would instantly sway the jury. He wanted the powerful patriarch of Ellis Holdings to claim responsibility, to declare that Jalen was merely a misguided subordinate acting under immense pressure. Jalen's eyes darted frantically across the wooden benches, his breathing shallow and rapid. He needed his father to look at the presiding judge and fix the unfixable disaster. He needed the man he had profoundly betrayed to suddenly forget the forgery, the theft, and the ultimate disloyalty. Jalen gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white, completely dependent on a paternal rescue that he fundamentally did not deserve. Jalen's frantic gaze finally locked onto the very back row of the gallery. Byron Ellis sat perfectly still in the dimly lit corner of the courtroom. He wore a severe, immaculate black suit. He did not lean forward to offer a reassuring nod. He did not attempt to make comforting eye contact with his son. His face was a mask of chiseled stone, completely devoid of any paternal warmth or underlying sorrow. Byron sat as a silent, detached observer, watching a stranger face the absolute consequences of their own actions. The sight of his father's unwavering, icy demeanor struck Jalen harder than the prosecutor's most damning physical evidence. Byron's silence was absolute. He had not brought a team of elite attorneys. He had not brought character references or mitigation strategies. He brought only his physical presence to bear witness to the end of his son's destructive era. The presiding judge specifically asked the defense if they intended to call any character witnesses to the stand before the sentencing phase officially commenced. Jalen turned fully around in his heavy wooden chair, pleading silently with his wide, terrified eyes. He willed his father to stand up, to clear his throat, to walk down the center aisle and save him. Byron did not move a single muscle. He stared straight ahead, his posture radiating the terrifying calm of an executive who had successfully neutralized a major corporate liability. That profound, unyielding silence echoed louder than any spoken confession. It was the final, undeniable nail in Jalen's coffin. The complete absence of Byron's intervention legally and emotionally sealed Jalen's fate. His father had officially abandoned him to the merciless machinery of the federal justice system. The presiding judge adjusted his reading glasses and looked down from the elevated mahogany bench. He addressed the silent courtroom with a voice devoid of any sympathy. He noted the severe, calculated nature of the corporate fraud and the sheer arrogance of the aggravated perjury. He explicitly stated that weaponizing the state family court system to cover up a grand larceny demonstrated a profound lack of moral character. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. He formally sentenced Jalen Ellis to serve exactly 5 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripping away any possibility of early parole. The heavy finality of the verdict slammed into Jalen like a physical blow. The remaining breath rushed out of his lungs. He slumped forward against the defense table as the reality of a concrete cage finally materialized. 2 armed federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward from the shadows. They grabbed Jalen by his shoulders and hauled him forcefully to his feet. The cold steel of heavy transport chains clanked loudly in the quiet courtroom as they bound his wrists to his waist and shackled his ankles. He was no longer a corporate executive or an heir to an empire. He was property of the state. As the bailiffs forcefully turned him toward the heavy holding cell door, Jalen twisted his neck for one final desperate look at the back row of the gallery. He wanted to see his father's reaction to the devastation. He wanted to see a single tear or a flicker of regret. Instead, he saw nothing but an empty wooden bench. Byron Ellis had already turned his back. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind the patriarch, leaving Jalen to face the absolute darkness entirely alone. Exactly 60 days passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung shut on Jalen Ellis. The torrential storms of the criminal trial had faded, leaving behind a profound, immaculate quiet within the walls of Byron's private estate. Byron sat at the center of his expansive mahogany desk in his home office, bathed in the sharp, clean light of a crisp Tuesday morning. He had completely diverted his formidable intellect away from the wreckage of his family and channeled it entirely into the expansion of his empire. Wide, intricately detailed architectural blueprints covered the polished wood surface before him. They detailed the construction of a massive state-of-the-art logistics hub, a physical manifestation of Ellis Holdings moving aggressively into the future. He traced the structural load-bearing walls with a silver pen, his mind operating with frictionless precision. He was building something new, something untainted by the greed and entitlement that had poisoned his previous legacy. The absolute silence of the room was suddenly shattered by the sharp, piercing ring of his private desk phone. Byron did not flinch. He slowly laid the silver pen down across the blueprints. He looked at the glowing digital caller identification display. The screen did not show a corporate partner or a vendor. It displayed the generic unassigned routing number of the regional state penitentiary. The automated system was bridging a gap across concrete walls and razor wire. The digital text blinked relentlessly, demanding his immediate attention. It was an intrusion from a ghost he had legally and emotionally buried 2 months prior. Byron stared at the flashing light. He understood exactly who was on the other end of the line. He understood the desperation fueling the call. He let the phone ring 3 times, allowing the electronic chime to echo through his serene sanctuary, weighing the absolute finality of what he was about to do. Byron reached across the desk and picked up the heavy receiver. He pressed the button to accept the automated collect charge from a federal inmate. The line clicked, followed by a harsh burst of static and the hollow echoing background noise of a crowded prison block. Then came the voice. It was undeniably Jalen, but the smooth, arrogant cadence of the former corporate prince was entirely gone. His voice was ragged, pitched high with a frantic, suffocating panic. He did not start with a greeting. He launched immediately into a breathless, chaotic torrent of desperate apologies. He wept openly through the receiver, his words stumbling over each other in a frantic race for salvation. Jalen swore he had been entirely blind. He aggressively shifted the entirety of the blame onto Vanessa, painting her as a manipulative parasite who had poisoned his mind and forced him into the corporate forgery. He claimed he was merely a victim of her toxic ambition. He pleaded for a single ounce of paternal mercy. He promised with manic intensity that he was a changed man. He swore upon his life that if Byron would simply open communication, he would spend the rest of his existence proving his absolute loyalty. He begged for a personal visit. He begged for his father to look him in the eye through the visitation glass. He pleaded for a lawyer for commissary funds for a single shred of the safety net he had spent his entire life exploiting. The raw terror in his voice was absolute. He was a man drowning in a cage of his own making, thrashing wildly in the dark, screaming for the captain of the ship he had tried to sink to throw him a life preserver. Byron sat perfectly motionless in his leather chair. He held the receiver to his ear, listening to the pathetic, weeping monologue echo across the digital connection. He did not interrupt the frantic stream of excuses. He did not raise his voice to counter the blatant lies about Vanessa's sole culpability. He allowed Jalen to completely empty his lungs, to exhaust every single manipulative tactic he possessed. Byron waited until the frantic pleading devolved into harsh, ragged gasps for air. The silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute, crackling with the static of the prison phone line. Byron did not offer comfort. He did not offer absolution. He spoke with the cold, immovable density of a concrete wall. He told his son that tears shed entirely out of self-preservation held absolutely no currency in the real world. He stated with brutal clarity that blaming a spouse for his own autonomous criminal greed was the ultimate cowardice. Byron's voice dropped to a low, lethal register. He delivered his final absolute directive. He informed Jalen that spoken promises meant absolutely nothing inside a federal cage. He told him that character is not built in the comfort of a luxury estate, but in the grueling, unforgiving reality of facing the absolute consequences of one's actions. Byron instructed him to stop begging for a rescue that was never coming. He ordered him to serve every single minute of his 5-year sentence. He commanded him to use the concrete and the steel to finally become a man. Jalen choked out a desperate, panicked protest, begging for one more minute. Byron did not listen. He lowered the receiver and severed the connection. The heavy plastic clicked firmly into the cradle, instantly cutting off the frantic voice and restoring the immaculate silence of the home office. Byron did not linger on the ghost he had just banished. He did not stare at the phone or allow a single second of regret to cloud his mind. The confrontation was over. The lesson was permanently delivered. He swiveled his chair toward his primary computer monitor. He pulled up his telecommunications provider portal with rapid, precise keystrokes. He navigated directly to his private account security settings. He entered the regional state penitentiary's outgoing automated routing number into the system. He executed a permanent, unalterable block on the digits. He completely eradicated Jalen's ability to breach his sanctuary ever again. There would be no future collect calls. There would be no frantic weekend voicemails. There would be no channel left open for emotional extortion. Byron deliberately severed the final fraying cord binding him to the toxic ruin of his past. The digital confirmation flashed across the screen, finalizing the absolute boundary he had established. He closed the application and pushed the keyboard away. He turned his attention back to the massive architectural blueprint spread across his mahogany desk. He picked up his silver pen. He leaned forward, his focus entirely consumed by the exact measurements of the new load-bearing walls. He began to calculate the precise structural requirements needed to support the massive expansion of Ellis Holdings. The poison had been completely extracted from his empire. The parasites had been starved and permanently exiled. The slate was entirely clean. Byron Ellis looked at the blank spaces on the blueprint, seeing only unlimited, unobstructed potential. He was alone, but his solitude was a fortress of absolute strength. The past was completely dead, and he was finally ready to build the future. The heavy rain pelted against the reinforced roof of the black luxury sedan, blurring the neon signs of the industrial park. It was a bleak Tuesday afternoon, precisely 2 months after the final gavel struck in federal court. Byron Ellis sat perfectly still in the spacious rear cabin. His driver parked the idling vehicle across the street from a decaying 24-hour diner situated on the outermost edge of the city's limits. The location was intentionally obscure, a place where exhausted shift workers and long-haul truckers congregated under flickering fluorescent lights. Byron did not look at his phone. He did not review any pending corporate acquisitions. He directed his unwavering focus entirely toward the greasy, rain-streaked windows of the establishment across the asphalt. He had utilized his vast intelligence network not to exact further vengeance, but to verify the absolute finality of his structural correction. He needed to confirm that the parasite had been permanently extracted from the host. He needed to see the physical manifestation of the consequences he had orchestrated. The quiet hum of the sedan's engine provided a stark contrast to the chaotic, desperate reality unfolding inside the diner. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, his expression a mask of impenetrable stone as he waited for the subject of his observation to appear. Byron watched intently through the dark-tinted glass of the sedan. A figure emerged from the swinging kitchen doors holding a plastic gray bus tub. It was Vanessa, the immaculate high society princess who had once demanded keys to luxury properties was completely unrecognizable. She wore a cheap, heavily stained polyester uniform that hung loosely on her frame. Her perfectly styled hair was scraped back into a messy utilitarian knot. She moved with a heavy, exhausted shuffle, clearing dirty plates and wiping down sticky formica tables with a frayed rag. Byron observed as a burly, impatient customer slammed his fist against a booth, loudly berating her over a delayed order. Weeks prior, Vanessa would have unleashed a torrent of arrogant entitlement. She would have demanded the manager. She would have weaponized her fabricated social standing. Now she simply froze. She bowed her head, her shoulders slumping in total, crushing submission. She silently absorbed the verbal abuse, quietly apologized, and scrambled back toward the kitchen. The sheer weight of her new reality had entirely pulverized her manufactured superiority. She was trapped in the grueling, unforgiving machinery of the working class she had spent her entire life actively despising. Byron's piercing gaze captured every detail of her profound humiliation, burning the image into his memory as definitive proof that the debt had been fully collected. Byron did not smile as he witnessed Vanessa's total degradation. He felt absolutely no triumphant joy. He felt no vindictive pleasure. He experienced only the cold, clinical satisfaction of an architect observing a perfectly balanced structure. The scales of justice had been forcefully recalibrated. The profound arrogance that had threatened to consume his family's legacy had been surgically eradicated. Vanessa's fabricated high society existence was now a distant, inaccessible memory. Her parents, Arthur and Eleanor, were currently residing in a cramped two-bedroom rental apartment on the undesirable side of the city, their entire legacy legally absorbed into the Ellis Holdings portfolio. They were completely severed from the elite circles they had leveraged for decades. The toxic influence that had poisoned Jalen's mind and fueled the corporate forgery was permanently neutralized. Byron had not destroyed them out of malice. He had simply forced them to inhabit the reality they had earned through their own autonomous greed. The aggressive tumor had been excised. The surrounding tissue was clean. He had protected the empire he built with his late wife, ensuring that her sacrifices would never be squandered by manipulative parasites. The quiet order of his universe was finally permanently restored. Byron reached forward and tapped a single heavy knuckle against the soundproof glass partition separating the front and rear cabins. The partition hummed softly as it lowered. He did not turn his head away from the diner window. He spoke with a quiet, absolute finality. He instructed his driver to put the vehicle in gear. He directed the chauffeur to leave the industrial district and navigate directly to the city's oldest, most serene cemetery. The violent corporate war was officially concluded. The devastating internal family conflict was permanently settled. Every single traitor had been identified, confronted, and exiled. The sprawling Ellis Holdings empire was completely secure and primed for massive, unprecedented expansion. There were no remaining enemies to crush and no further debts to collect. The slate was entirely clean. Byron leaned back into the plush leather seat and finally closed his eyes as the heavy sedan smoothly accelerated away from the curb. The relentless storm outside mirrored the chaos he had just survived, but inside the vehicle there was only profound silence. It was time to leave the battlefield behind. It was time to visit the immaculate marble headstone on the hill. It was finally time to make absolute peace with the only person whose opinion truly mattered. The heavy black sedan pulled smoothly through the towering wrought iron gates of the Oakwood Memorial Park. The violent storm that had battered the city all morning finally broke, retreating eastward toward the distant, jagged mountains. The thick gray clouds fractured, allowing brilliant golden shafts of sunlight to pierce the gloom and illuminate the rolling, perfectly manicured emerald lawns. Byron Ellis stepped out of the vehicle before his driver could even unlatch the heavy door. The air smelled of wet earth and crushed pine needles. He walked along the winding cobblestone path, his polished leather shoes moving with deliberate, unhurried precision. He climbed the gentle incline of the highest hill in the sanctuary, a place reserved for total quiet and absolute peace. Droplets of rainwater clung to the grass, glittering like shattered glass in the sudden piercing sunlight. Byron reached the crest of the hill. He stopped before a pristine, meticulously carved marble headstone. The stone was completely free of moss or decay, reflecting the meticulous care he demanded for this specific square of earth. The name Nadine Ellis was etched deep into the flawless white surface, flanked by the dates that framed a life of profound partnership and shared ambition. The silence at the top of the hill was immaculate. It was not the suffocating silence of the federal courtroom or the tense quiet of the corporate boardroom. It was the absolute resonant stillness of a completed mission. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared against the chilling breeze rolling off the distant river. For weeks he had worn an impenetrable mask of cold calculation to execute the systematic destruction of his enemies. Now standing alone before the physical marker of his greatest loss, the formidable armor of the ruthless chief executive softened just enough to fully reveal the devoted husband beneath. Byron stared at the carved letters of her name and began to speak. His deep baritone voice carried no hesitation, echoing softly over the empty sunlit hills. He told his wife that the long, brutal war was officially over. He delivered a complete, unvarnished accounting of the total devastation he had wrought over the past 2 months. He explained how he had systematically dismantled the extravagant, pathetic lies their son had constructed. He recounted the complete financial annihilation of the Howell family and the subsequent federal sentencing of Jalen. He did not ask for forgiveness for the ruin he had orchestrated. He presented his actions as the fulfillment of a sacred binding vow. He reminded Nadine of the grueling decades they had spent building Ellis Holdings from absolute nothingness. They had sacrificed their youth, their sleep, and their peace to forge a completely unassailable empire. He promised her on her deathbed that he would protect their legacy against any external threat. He told the silent marble stone that he had kept his word even when the gravest threat materialized from their own bloodline. He described the suffocating entitlement that had slowly infected Jalen's mind. He explained how that entitlement metastasized into a toxic greed, driving their only son to steal, to forge, and to betray the very foundation of their family. Byron stated that he could not allow the disease of unearned arrogance to consume the monumental achievement they had sacrificed everything to build. He had to act as the ultimate surgeon. He excised the cancer completely, cutting out the infected tissue without a single ounce of mercy. He stood before his late wife and declared that the corporate empire bearing her name was finally secure, permanently cleansed of the parasites who sought to drain it dry. The golden sunlight warmed the chilling afternoon air, casting a long, sharp shadow behind Byron's imposing figure. There was absolutely zero regret vibrating in his steady, deep voice. He did not mourn the severe, unyielding discipline he had forced upon his son. He understood with crystalline clarity that rescuing Jalen from the consequences of his multiple felony convictions would have been the ultimate act of paternal cowardice. It would have validated a lifetime of profound disrespect. Byron recognized that true love occasionally demands the execution of ruthless, agonizing destruction. He chose to destroy his son's fabricated reality, to offer him the singular, brutal opportunity to build genuine character behind the cold, unforgiving concrete walls. He spoke directly to the marble headstone, his words forging an unbreakable testament to their shared values. He had preserved their mutual dignity against a concerted campaign of high society humiliation. He ensured that the massive wealth generated by their decades of relentless labor would not be squandered by entitled cowards or inherited by manipulative socialites who offered nothing but disdain. The Ellis name would never become a footnote in a story of squandered generational wealth. The empire would continue to expand, guided exclusively by competence, loyalty, and unwavering strength. He had watched the people who mocked their origins reduced to begging for scraps of grace. He had watched them load their designer luggage into rented moving trucks. He had witnessed the ultimate restoration of universal balance. The pain of paternal betrayal had initially threatened to shatter his spirit, but he had forged that agony into a weapon of absolute precision. He stood before the grave completely unburdened. The heavy, suffocating weight of disappointment was gone. He had navigated the darkest betrayal imaginable and emerged entirely victorious, holding the reins of a cleansed, infinitely powerful dynasty. Byron reached inside the lapel of his tailored charcoal jacket. He produced a single, flawless, velvet-petaled white rose. It was completely unblemished, a vivid symbol of the pure, enduring devotion that had driven his ruthless campaign for justice. He knelt slowly, the damp grass pressing against the expensive fabric of his trousers. He laid the fresh bloom gently at the base of the gleaming, rain-washed marble headstone, positioning it perfectly below her carved name. He lingered for one final silent heartbeat, locking the profound peace of the sanctuary into his mind. He stood back up, his towering silhouette commanding the quiet hilltop. He gave his late wife a brief, respectful nod. He turned his back to the grave and began to descend the steep, grassy hill. His heavy leather shoes struck the cobblestone path with steady, powerful, unyielding strides. He did not look back over his shoulder. The emotional closure was absolute. He walked toward the idling luxury sedan, waiting at the iron gates, moving with the terrifying, majestic grace of a conquering king. He was a self-made titan who had demanded basic human respect from the world around him. When that respect was arrogantly denied, when his legacy was threatened by the very people meant to uphold it, he did not cower. He did not negotiate. He systemically dismantled their lives and took absolutely everything they valued. The sky above the cemetery cleared entirely, bathing the vast, glittering Ellis Holdings skyline in the distance in brilliant, triumphant light. The heavy door of the black sedan clicked shut, sealing the apex predator safely inside his moving fortress. The tires gripped the wet asphalt, carrying him forward into a future he exclusively controlled. The engine faded into the distance. The screen fades to absolute black. True strength is not measured by the wealth one accumulates, but by the boundaries one is willing to clearly enforce. We frequently believe that unconditional love requires infinite forgiveness, permitting toxic individuals to repeatedly exploit our compassion. However, continually enabling destructive behavior only guarantees inevitable mutual ruin. Setting absolute limits remains an act of profound self-respect and necessary survival. When you constantly shield someone from the devastating consequences of their own calculated actions, you effectively rob them of the opportunity to develop genuine character. Authentic personal growth fundamentally demands severe accountability. Sometimes the most powerful act is walking away completely. Share your thoughts on Byron's final decision in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for the next chapter of this story.